the eldest daughter of the Count de Lanche, Lillian Lelanche. The main character was born into a marriage in which there was no true love. And after the funeral of Lillian's mother, the Count brought into the family an illegitimate son from his mistress. From that moment on, all the attention of the relatives was focused on the new family member, and the girl could only watch everything from the sidelines because absolutely everyone stopped noticing her. Moreover, the main character was no longer considered a family member, and she was on her own. But one day, Lillian's father and stepmother died in an accident while riding in a carriage. At the funeral, the girl and her half-brother looked at their parents and laid flowers. Those who came to honor the memory of the Count and Countess actively discussed what had happened, trying to understand whether it really was an accident. The girls also expressed their concerns to each other about the next head of the family, since Lillian and Edmund were too young. But when the funeral was coming to an end, a man appeared who introduced himself as the heroine's maternal uncle and said that she would now become the head of the family. The man continued and explained that Lillian was the real heir, not her half-brother. The girl herself was shocked by this, and she doubted the correctness of this decision, so she asked again. And the young man immediately reminded that after the death of the heroine's mother, no one noticed her, and obviously she would be the first to be gotten rid of. The man also explained his words and warning by saying that he did not want his niece to be treated so badly. Lillian understood everything, but since it was not up to her to decide, she was unsure, to which her uncle said not to worry and to trust him. After all, in the opinion of the young man, only the main character is capable of becoming the head of the family. But these words greatly shocked the girl, since she had always lived in the shadow of her late mother and was subjected to all kinds of bullying. Since that conversation, a lot has changed. Lillian has endless wealth, and she never denied herself anything. The girl also took absolutely all the attention and received complete freedom of action. Over time, taking advantage of the heroine's position, Uncle Henry began to take her to gambling houses, counting on luck. The girl was not very concerned about Edmund's fate, since she did not have time due to family matters. Lillian quickly fell into the trap of entertainment, just as Henry had wished, and soon she began to suffer from hallucinations, unaware that her life was getting worse with each passing day. Time passed very quickly, and the main character became quite an adult. One day, Lillian was being dragged by two young men in an unknown direction, while the girl herself was screaming, asking them to let her go. The heroine's uncle approached her and explained to the servants that this was their main pearl, which they needed to be careful with, because the price could drop due to scratches. At this point, the girl began to get indignant and ask what he was doing, since she had already agreed to a marriage of convenience and there was no need to think about the price. But the man smiled and reminded his niece that she was a legionnaire. Lillian didn't expect to hear this and just looked at her uncle in shock. The legionnaire is a creature with incredible abilities. Such creatures are no different from people, but when using abilities, their appearance changes. The man almost immediately said that even his sister had not told him about such important things before her death, but suggested that at that time, the girl had not yet fully awakened her power, since this usually continues until the age of 5. Continuing, the heroine's uncle expressed his joy that the price for the girl was quite high because the family just needed the money. But the heroine, realizing what was happening, said that the man would answer for all this, since she was the head of the family. The young man made it clear to Lillian that no one here perceived her or considered her to be the main one. After all, everything was agreed upon by all the relatives, and even if the girl disappears, no one will worry, and her new owner will take care of her, so she should not even allow the thought of death. The main character immediately realized that she needed to run away from here as quickly as possible and began to try to get back on her feet. But realizing that her strength was completely exhausted and she could not get up, Lillian panicked. And at that moment, the man began proudly telling that the girl had been given medication before, and now she wouldn't even be able to move. Immediately after these words, while the heroine was recovering from the shock, the servants began to blindfold her, and the uncle asked them to be careful so as not to leave bruises. Lillian didn't understand what was happening and why she was born at all, because she assumed that this was her end. But suddenly, the main character was freed and led by the hand with a request to run away as quickly as possible. The girl was confused and tried to understand who it was, because it was definitely impossible to confuse her with someone else. The young man was covered in blood and, without turning around, asked Lillian to run as far as possible. After all, at this point the young man's role in defense is over, and his strength is completely exhausted. And having said everything, the young man fell to the ground, and the main character immediately realized that this was her half-brother Edmund. The moment Lillian's savior lost his life force, she gained healing powers. The girl immediately felt guilty because she realized that the uncle she trusted betrayed her, and the brother she ignored saved her life. The wounds the heroine had received while trying to save Edmund were now beginning to hurt, and Lillian thought that she would die along with her brother. Suddenly, a young man appeared who suggested that the effect of the poison was too long and the process could not be stopped. In addition, the stranger noticed that Edmund was badly wounded, but thanks to his healing abilities, he saved his life. Closing the heroine's eyes, the young man noted that with such abilities, she could have saved his son, but he still understood that it was too late. But the young man did not see any reaction to his words and assumed that Lillian still could not come to her senses, so he asked if the girl wanted to live. The main character immediately announced her desire to live because she wants to save Edmund, who died because of her stupid choice, and also take revenge on those who betrayed her. The young man realized that Lillian was still full of determination and decided to give her another chance. But continuing, the stranger added that in exchange he would take the girl's heart. After these words, the young man repeated what he had said earlier, and everything sparkled red, and lightning appeared around. Lillian stood in shock and tried to comprehend what was happening. After all, looking around, the heroine realized that she was again at the funeral of her father and stepmother. The girls standing nearby showed sympathy for the girl, but still decided not to interfere in the family relationship. Lillian herself continued to stand silently and tried to understand what had happened, assuming that it was all a dream. After that stranger, everything was completely foggy, and it was difficult to figure out what was happening. Aunt Vanessa ran out of patience and began to indignantly ask what the girl was thinking about because she was not reacting to anything. But at that moment, the main character realized that her aunt had hit her in the face, which is why she now had a red mark on her cheek. And everyone around looked at Lillian with interest, which made her finally convinced that the funeral was the same as when she was 12 years old. Therefore, the heroine immediately realized that she had indeed returned to the past. The woman, having not heard an answer, said that the children could only be brought to their senses with a slap on the back of the head and was about to move on to action. But Lillian got ahead of her and hit her aunt in the face in return, which left her in shock. And looking at Vanessa's reaction, the girl found this whole situation funny and did not regret what she had done, because if she really had returned to the past, then she was no longer going to tolerate such an attitude towards herself. The woman herself was very angry about this, and she immediately asked how she dared to hit her. The main character began to innocently repeat her aunt's words and say that a slap in the face could bring her to her senses. So, smiling, Lillian said she guessed that Vanessa needed to come to her senses, because the woman always hated the heroine and tried to get her hands on the family's wealth. So the aunt is also involved in Lillian's death and must be punished. And not only Vanessa, because all adults are blinded by money and are ready to sacrifice an innocent girl for it. And death itself means nothing to these people, so killing someone to gain profit is a simple task. And, unfortunately before, the main character did not know that her relatives would get rid of her without a single word. Vanessa continued to be angry and said that the girl was completely crazy if she allowed herself to behave like that. Lillian agreed with a smile to these words and noted that the woman could immediately understand this because the heroine no longer wants to live like this. The aunt was even more outraged by these words, and she immediately warned her niece that she would not become an heir, no matter how hard she tried. But the main character was already ignoring Vanessa and looking out for the person she needed in the crowd. And having found her brother, Lillian immediately and silently headed in his direction. The woman, looking at the heroine leaving, finally realized that they were not listening to her and told the girl that she could not cope without her help. Continuing, Vanessa warned Lillian that she would not forgive her for this, even if she crawled on her knees, but the heroine herself did not answer. After all, the main character didn't want any help from such terrible people and decided that she could handle it herself. And while the girl was thinking about this, she had already reached her brother and was glad that they had finally met. So, turning to the boy, Lillian said that she understood that now was not the best time to greet him. Edmund himself had a bandage on his leg to allow it to fully heal after the incident. Looking at her brother, the heroine noticed that he was quite smart for his 10 years and assumed that he was very scared after the accident. Lillian also remembered that her father and stepmother did not love her at all, but were kind to Edmund. And despite all this, the main character extended her hand to her brother and suggested that they try to get along. The boy was a little surprised and confused by such a proposal, so he simply remained silent. But Lillian continued to wait for an answer from her brother and thought that they both understood the situation they were in, and if they were to quarrel, it would only cause more suspicion. And Edmund, after a couple of minutes, albeit with distrust, agreed to try to improve relations with the heroine. The girl immediately thought that all this might seem suspicious, but with time everything would become clear. After all, other people may not understand, but not Edmund. And the main character wants to pay her debt to her family, so now everything will be different. Lillian, already sitting in the attic, was completely convinced that this was not a dream, and tried to accept the fact that she was here again. Looking around, the girl began to think about the man she saw just before her death. After all, this young man seemed unfamiliar to the heroine at the time, but now she comes to understand. And this was the head of the ducal family von Hart, the most famous legionnaire and a man of the highest rank. The young man was also the main culprit in the massacre of the legionnaires. But Lillian didn't know why the young man had treated the legionnaires this way, and didn't understand why she had met him in particular. After thinking about this, the girl assumed that Edmund had already heard rumors that she was being held captive by her relatives. But still, this does not explain anything, because that day Hart said that the heroine could save his son, and after this thought she realized that the young man really turned back time. Lillian tensed a little because the legionnaires were special, so she understood that the young man had done something to her heart. And after that, the girl suggested that Hart, like her, remembers the future. But be that as it may, the main character figured out a lot and now everything is clear to her. Luckily, Lillian can now use her powers freely, something she couldn't do in the past. And first of all, the girl decided that she needed to meet with Duke von Hart. In the gambling house, one could hear all sorts of rumors, so the next day after the discovery of her legionary gift, the heroine was there. Sitting at the table, Lillian thought about how her migraines had gotten worse lately and it seemed strange to her. At that moment, the girl sitting next to them asked the young men if they had heard that the heir of Duke von Hart had lost his power and lost it. One of the young men asked again, to which she responded with her own assumption that the boy's own talent almost killed him. The main character immediately realized that the Duke's son was very obsessed with his abilities. The legionnaires themselves are very powerful beings with supernatural abilities, and in any family a child could be born with the gift of a legionnaire and awaken his power. The gift of the legion is very rare, but having awakened this power, a person is obliged to register and receive the status of a legionnaire so that the state can use his power for military purposes. And among the legionnaires, Duke von Hart was considered very powerful, and the heroine had heard about the misfortune of the man's son more than once. While the girl was thinking about everything, one of the young men called this situation a terrible fate, but the other said that the more the legionnaires use their abilities, the closer they are to mental illness. But the girl noted that it rarely happens that both father and son are legionnaires, to which the young man replied that the Duke's son is now considered harmless. The main character could not discuss anything at this time as she was sitting and suffering from a severe headache. And while Lillian was trying to understand what was happening to her, literally a second later she began to fall out of her chair. Everyone immediately jumped up from their seats and began to look at the heroine with concern, trying to shout to her. But suddenly everything started to glow pink, and the boys' excitement turned to shock. Because the main character changed her appearance, everyone immediately realized that she was a legionnaire. And remembering all this in the present time, Lillian assumed that it was then that her uncle became aware of her abilities. A disarmed legionary is one who has lost his strength but retained his outward signs, and therefore they were sold to influential people for a huge price as a strange creature. And in the same way, the main character was sold in her past life so that she would simply be someone's souvenir. But it's unlikely that Lillian's mother told anyone about this, much less her brother. And the Countess was the only one who knew, and she didn't even tell the heroine's father that the girl was a neutralized legionnaire. Thinking back, Lillian had a flashback to when she was excitedly telling her mother about the flowers in the garden, but she was very upset about something. And the woman said that even when the heroine was not even a month old, her father continued to run to another woman. Getting up from her chair, the Countess continued, and not understanding how he could betray them, said that the man had married another. Then, leaning towards her daughter, the woman asked if she had seen her half-brother because he was a copy of her father. And the Countess did not understand why Lillian was completely different from the Count. In the end, the woman spoke out and immediately began to cry without leaving her child. Now that she thought about it, Lillian assumed that circumstances required her mother to keep any problems concerning the girl hidden, and that no matter what happened, only they knew about it. Suddenly, someone called out to the main character, and she stopped. Recognizing this unpleasant voice, Lillian immediately turned towards the source of the sound with displeasure. It was Henry who immediately smiled at the sight of his niece and expressed his joy as he wanted to talk. The heroine herself immediately remembered that despite the fact that the funeral had already taken place, the relatives still did not leave their house and expressed a desire to stay for a couple more days to honor the memory of the deceased. But now Lillian realizes that everyone stayed for a completely different reason. In the end, the girl decided to be patient with her uncle, and he approached her and asked where she was rushing to. Suddenly, the man changed the subject and, after examining his niece, asked how this had happened. Henry didn't like the heroine's dress and thought she looked like she had taken the outfit from a passing beggar. Continuing, the young man said that he expected this after his sister died because the Count and his wife abandoned the girl, to which she replied that this was indeed her only dress. After these words, the man said that he had something to talk to Lillian about, but later he suggested that she go and order a dress. And the main character didn't give an answer right away, so Henry asked again what she thought about it. Hearing this, Lillian immediately smiled and expressed her joy, asking again if she really could have a new dress. The girl herself thought that since Uncle Henry wanted to use her for his own purposes, now she would ruin him with her whims, and that would be the end of it. As a result, the main character and her uncle went to the boutique for new clothes. Lillian immediately began trying on dresses and almost every girl wanted to buy, talking about it. And while Henry was shocked by the amount, the saleswoman stood and admired the young lady's taste. So the man decided to tell the girl that he couldn't handle such a bill. The heroine immediately began to apologize, saying that she forgot herself and thought that she could do anything, but the uncle did not accept the apology as he felt awkward. And continuing, Henry said that Lillian should not deny herself anything, as long as the girl herself did not need these dresses, and she was simply taking advantage of the opportunity to ruin the family. So the girl simply expressed her joy that she had such a wonderful uncle to rely on. After completing her shopping, Lillian looked out and began to look around to make sure no one was around. But the heroine was almost completely sure that there was no one here, since she had checked this exit many times. And when she left, the girl was pleased that she had emptied her uncle's wallet, but now she had to find Hart's artifact before she was caught. While Lillian was thinking about her next steps, a young man was watching her from around the corner and waiting. And when the girl went to look for the artifact, with the thought that it was somewhere nearby, the stranger grabbed her hand, pulling her towards him. The main character was very frightened by this, and she simply froze in shock and couldn't even resist. But as soon as the boy pulled Lillian towards him, he was immediately glad that he had finally found her. And while the heroine herself was trying to understand who this young man was, he was already interested in where she had been. The boy noticed something and began to look around, while Lillian continued to look at him silently. But as soon as the heroine wanted to start a dialogue, the stranger stopped her and grabbed her hand. Hugging the girl, the young man told her that her uncle was coming here and she should not raise her head. The man walked around looking for his niece, shouting her name and looking in every corner. Henry was angry because the heroine had always been very obedient and he thought there would be no problems with her, but now she was running away. But suddenly the man's attention was drawn to a boy standing in the shadows. While looking, Henry saw his niece and the girl standing next to the young man and began to call her. The stranger noticed this, so he immediately raised his head and looked at the man with a stern gaze. This frightened the young man greatly, as the boy seemed to him very similar to the evil magician. And without delay, Henry turned in the opposite direction and, assuming that Lillian would not approach a bad boy, began to move away. Having made sure it was safe, the stranger looked at the girl and she almost immediately asked if the man had left. And the young man replied that there was no one else, which is why the heroine immediately began to look around to see for herself. But the boy, noticing this, asked Lillian not to look back like that, otherwise they might be suspected. The main character looked at the young man and tried to understand who he was and why he decided to save her. After all, this man was completely unknown to the girl, and she could not remember anything about him. The stranger broke the silence at this point and said that if Lillian wanted to look at him, she could look straight ahead and not be shy, and also speak if she had anything to say. The heroine immediately asked why he saved her and began to express many of her assumptions on this matter, which left the young man a little confused. Continuing, the girl said that they might be accomplices, but the stranger covered her mouth with his hand and replied that he really helped her because they were in a similar situation. And while Lillian assumed that the young man was only pretending to know her in order to help, he asked where she was going. But the main character thanked the boy and in response asked about his plans, to which he said that he was not going anywhere. Continuing, the stranger warned Lillian that for her own safety she should not approach the man. And then the young man took off his cloak and silently put it on the heroine. Afterwards, the boy explained that if Lillian walked around like that, people would understand that she was the daughter of an aristocrat and had gotten lost on the street. The young man himself will cope, but if they are suddenly separated, the girl needs to be as inconspicuous as possible. So the main character must take the cloak and leave carefully without attracting attention. Lillian looked at her savior and thought that although he was harsh, he still helped her, and she could not believe that she accidentally met such a person. And for some reason, the girl thought that this meeting was the beginning of something good, so after wishing the young man good luck and thanking him for his help, she went about her business. Having found the right tavern, the main character did not hesitate and went inside. The bartender was glad to see the first customer and, turning all his attention to the door, began to greet Lillian. But seeing a little girl in the doorway, the young man paused and asked her about the purpose of her visit. Continuing, the man warned that if the heroine was looking for her parents, then there was no one in the tavern except flies, so she definitely wouldn't find them here. Lillian noticed the ball used to identify legionnaires and assumed that this was not an ordinary tavern and that she had come to the right place. Therefore, the main character immediately expressed her desire to see Mr. Calvados. Calvados is the name given to apple brandy, but few people know that it was the pseudonym of Duke von Hart. But the young man refused the girl, saying that he would not sell her anything without her parents' permission. Lillian didn't like that the man understood everything, but said the opposite, and so she explained that if she needed alcohol, she wouldn't call him as if he were a person. Without looking up from his book, the young man replied that he did not know from whom the heroine heard that Hart could be found here, but the little girl had no business here. Lillian continued to insist on her own and told about her abilities as a legionnaire, but the young man did not believe it, since many people claimed this, and explained that the legionnaires did not go here, but to register at the office. The heroine said that she came to Mr. Calvados because she did not want to register her gift. After all, Lillian has the ability to heal, and she heard that the Duke is extremely interested in people like her. But the man again did not believe him and asked the girl who told her this, which made her angry because of his stubbornness. And realizing that there was no choice, the heroine decided to prove everything with the help of the ball, but the young man thought that it would be useless anyway, and said so. After these words, Lillian placed her hand on the ball in order to show that she was not an imposter and was telling the truth. Everything around instantly began to shine with a golden hue, and bright butterflies flew throughout the tavern. The man was very shocked by this and silently watched the magic, thinking that it was incredible. But suddenly everything went out and became as before, and the ball itself broke. Lillian was very surprised and did not understand how this happened, so she immediately asked why the item broke. And a few minutes later, the main character was already sitting at the table with a nice non-alcoholic drink. But the girl found the tea very sweet, and she did not understand why the man thought that all children only like sweets. Lillian also realized that the young man's attitude immediately changed as soon as he found out that she was a legionnaire, because he immediately offered her tea and all sorts of goodies. At that moment, the young man approached the heroine and asked her not to go anywhere and to wait for him. Lillian assumed the man had gone after the Duke, but was surprised that he immediately closed the store, and continuing to sit and wait, the girl thought, and, assuming that she was much stronger than she thought, could not believe it. But suddenly, the main character's attention was drawn to a door that began to open. It was Duke von Hart, whom Lillian had been so persistent in trying to meet. Looking at the man, the girl did not understand why he was wearing such ridiculous glasses, but she remained silent. At that moment, the Duke himself began to indignantly address the heroine, to which she reacted with surprise and did not know what to answer. And while Hart was approaching Lillian, the girl, from such a reaction to her, assumed that he also remembered his life before returning. But, having reached the table, the man unexpectedly and angrily hit the surface, which made the heroine very scared. Continuing, the Duke looked sternly at Lillian and asked where she got that cloak. The main character immediately said that this cloak was given to her as a gift, but this was not enough for the man, and he asked for details. The girl was very scared and did not understand why Hart was interrogating her. Their conversation was interrupted by a man who suggested that Lillian shouldn't be pressed so hard, since she was just a child no older than 10 years old. But the heroine herself was indignant and said that she was already 12 and there was no need to treat her like a child. Although in her thoughts, the girl still understood that the Duke perceived her as no more than a small child. After a pause, Von Hart explained that his son was about the same size, so he was just curious, but Lillian at that moment realized that the man did not recognize her and was surprised. After all, if Hart remembered his past life, he would have persuaded the main character to leave. But the Duke, whom Lillian met then, really wanted to save his son, and even if he doesn't remember his past life, it doesn't change anything. In the end, the man finally believed the girl and suggested changing locations for further conversation. And despite a little anxiety, the main character understood that there was no point in hesitating because Von Hart had power, and Lillian needs to protect herself from Henry and his relatives, whom she deeply curses. Very soon, the girl and the Duke moved into a small room to assess its capabilities. Sitting down at the table, the man asked again whether the heroine really had the healing abilities of a legionnaire, to which she immediately answered in the affirmative. Continuing, Hart cut his hand and asked Lillian to demonstrate her abilities. The main character was a little confused, as she did not expect that a man would want to test her skills without additional discussions. But as soon as the girl thought about Edmund, who was on the verge of death, her abilities began to manifest themselves, and Lillian suggested that perhaps she had never truly wanted to save someone before. The young man, watching from the side, was very surprised and froze in place, because the wound disappeared almost instantly, and for the young man this skill seemed incredible. But the Duke himself suggested that Lillian was taking on other people's wounds, and she immediately tensed up because she realized that she had been exposed. The man continued and asked the heroine to what extent these abilities could be used. The girl immediately said that this was not the limit, but she could only treat an ordinary person or a legionnaire. But when Hart asked about treating sick people, the main character immediately became upset and thoughtful. After all, if Lillian's abilities were more advanced, she would have saved Edmund in her past life. Therefore, the girl did not hide it and said that she could not treat sick people, to which the man immediately looked thoughtfully. This look made Lillian feel uneasy, and she assumed that the Duke now thought that her abilities were not so healing. But upset, looking at the cut, the main character realized that she was still quite capable, because such wounds heal quickly. And despite the fact that the girl was poorly fed and raised, she was left with no scars, and her wounds healed faster than others. But in the past, no one really cared about this. The man broke the silence a couple of minutes later and called Lillian's ability unusual. But continuing, the Duke said that he did not understand why the heroine needed all this, so he told her to return home. The girl was immediately taken aback by this outcome and could not find the words to respond. And while the man was about to leave, Lillian could not accept the fact that they would just break up. After all, if the heroine leaves, then everything will simply collapse, and you need to convince Hart at any cost, make it so that he cannot refuse. So the girl interrupted the Duke's preparations and asked if everything was okay. And continuing, Lillian explained that the stronger the legionnaire, the more susceptible he is to corruption due to strength, and if he is unlucky, he can die. But healing is not limited to small wounds. The main character can save Von Hart from his wrath. After these words, the Duke could not stand it and sharply asked the girl about her proposal. Hearing this, Lillian decided not to miss the chance and immediately said that she could save the life of the man's son because she was sure that he loved him. Then the heroine smiled and explained her confidence by the fact that an indifferent father would not even know his son's clothing size. Besides, the Duke is one of those who are ready to sacrifice their lives when on the verge of death. To this, Von Hart asked what exactly Lillian wanted, and she replied that she simply wanted to use his power until she reached maturity. Since the girl's mother and father recently died in an accident, and Edmund is the only direct heir, feud between relatives is inevitable, and the main character wants her brother to calmly accept the inheritance. In the end, as soon as Lillian finished speaking, the man asked again, and the girl confirmed that it just took time, because when she grew up, everything would stabilize. In the meantime, the heroine asked Von Hart to protect her in order to survive this time. The Duke was shocked by this request and asked for more details. And to this question, Lillian confidently said that the man would definitely not regret choosing her. After meeting with Duke Von Hart, the main character returned safely to the Count's estate. The girl tried to explain her absence with tears and deception, since throughout the day Henry scolded her and tried to find out where she was, but the heroine paid almost no attention to it. After all, her uncle's incessant scolding seemed pointless to Lillian, and so she simply headed towards Edmund. Knocking on the door, the main character immediately said that it was her and asked permission to enter, to which the boy was surprised. Upon entering, Lillian immediately asked her brother if he was feeling better, and he answered in the affirmative, but asked why she had come. The girl herself, looking around, assumed that Edmund often had relatives because there were flowers, toys, and amazing cleanliness around. Therefore, the heroine asked the boy if everyone really visited him often, to which he immediately confirmed his sister's assumption. But Lillian was a little upset by this answer, because Edmund was, as always, brief. As she approached the bed, the girl realized that her brother had not changed since the day they first met, and even when he should be careful, he behaved meekly, and it seemed strange to her now that she had such hostility towards him. And having thought everything over, the main character asked the boy if he had already thought about the inheritance. Edmund was a little confused by this question and said that he didn't know anything yet. Hearing this, Lillian assumed that his relatives were forcing the boy to lead the family and asked him again if he had thought about it, to which he replied negatively. Continuing, the main character said that she had been made the same offer. The girl then explained that her relatives were looking for a suitable puppet, and they must have thought that children were easily influenced. And Lillian understood that if she were older, she would not pay attention to these people at all, so she asked her brother not to accept such offers under any circumstances. But the heroine also made it clear to the boy that she was not forcing him, and the choice, of course, was his. Edmund decided to change the subject a little and asked his sister why she was telling him this, which shocked Lillian. And continuing, the boy hesitantly asked the main character if she was offended by him, because he always thought that she hated him. After these words, Lillian realized that she had never trusted her family. The reason for the lack of trust was that the heroine did not have a single good memory associated with her parents. After all, the second mother constantly complained and the father ignored her. The woman was obsessed with Lillian's biological father, but eventually got stabbed in the back. And the girl had to remove the veil from her eyes and look at everything completely differently. But Lillian will never forget the time when a glimmer of light appeared in the pitch darkness. That's why now, when talking to her brother, the girl said that she wasn't at all offended by him. Moreover, in this world, for the main character, Edmund is the only close person. And since the heroine has no other close people, she decided to stop hating Edmund. However, the boy decided to ask whether Lillian wanted to get her father's inheritance, to which the heroine replied that she was not interested in that. After all, from now on, the main character decided to believe only in justice and honesty. Edmund was surprised by such words and even decided to ask again to understand what she meant. After some time, Lillian was already sitting in her room and eating sweets. After thinking about it, the heroine realized that thanks to the fact that she showed sincerity, the attitude towards her became much better. The girl's brother demanded a better room for her since she was a legitimate daughter. And one day, sitting on the bed next to his sister, the boy told her to quickly move out of her room. Lillian was surprised by Edmund's concern, but her thoughts were interrupted by a maid who looked in on her and informed her of the arrival of guests. The heroine was shocked by such an unexpected visit, and while the girl tried to accept what was happening, the maid stood waiting to escort her. As it turned out, this guest was Duke von Hart, which made Lillian immediately smile. After some time, the maids brought luxurious dishes of expensive meat and fish to serve on the table. The main character herself, as soon as she came out to everyone, froze in shock and could not believe what was happening. After all, next to Hart were Henry and Vanessa, who were quite excited by the man's arrival. Without further ado, Lillian grabbed the edges of her dress and greeted the Duke, introducing herself as her eldest daughter. Then, smiling at the man, the main character said that she was glad to meet him. The Duke told the girl to sit down, while the aunt laughed and said that she did not know that Madame Lanches knew the Duke. And while Lillian was sitting down at the table, her aunt decided to call her own, which made the heroine grimace. Duke von Hart himself was handsome, and Lillian couldn't believe that her uncle and aunt were so surprised and didn't try to seize the opportunity. However, the main character saw many gift boxes behind the Duke and immediately became interested in them. At that moment, the man looked towards the girl because he noticed her gaze. And Hart immediately told Lillian that these were her gifts, to which she was very surprised. That's why the heroine asked again, because she didn't believe that there were so many boxes and all the gifts were for her. But as it turned out, the Duke did not have time to get flowers, so he decided to simply buy out all possible gifts. Vanessa was surprised by such concern towards Lillian, while the girl herself thought that perhaps she would not be able to keep her word after all. Henry tried to find out how exactly the heroine met Hart and suggested that the man was familiar with her biological mother. But when the man said that he was the main character's guardian, it shocked everyone. The uncle immediately began to shout that he had never heard anything about this, but the Duke immediately asked whether they really had such a bad opinion of the Duke of Heart's family. After all, the man doesn't care about time, money, or manners, and he's going to take Lillian under his wing. In addition, Von Hart considered the girl to be very smart and would like her to become his son's wife, which surprised her very much. Therefore, the heroine immediately began to look at the Duke in shock, thinking about her son's own opinion and why no one asked her about it. The relatives immediately began to praise their niece, while Lillian, although she was sure that it was a joke, still felt a little awkward. Von Hart continued at this point and said that he had to be aware of the conditions in which the girl was growing up, so he asked to be shown her room after dinner. But Vanessa immediately refused because she considers it wrong to look into a little girl's room. Lillian interrupted the woman, saying that if the Duke didn't mind that the room looked a bit old, then she didn't mind. These words made the aunt very angry, as she was sure that the heroine knew how Hart would react to the conditions of her life. And if we talk about how Lillian is raised, then the woman will also have problems. So Vanessa decided that she should take matters into her own hands to avoid difficulties. Entering the room, the Duke began to look around thoughtfully and assumed that this was just a dressing room or a playroom. But the main character immediately responded negatively and explained that this was her bedroom. The man didn't like this and asked why there wasn't a better room in such a large estate, which immediately made the relatives feel more awkward. Seeing this, Lillian realized that they were afraid that the Duke would notice their terrible attitude and would now try to hide everything. And Vanessa immediately turned to the heroine, assuming that she was very worried about Von Hart becoming her guardian. After these words, the woman turned to the Duke and explained that this was only a punishment room and the girl had a separate bedroom. But the man himself asked again with displeasure, and Vanessa continued, saying that Lillian goes here when she is naughty. And then the aunt asked the main character not to lie, despite the desire to get more attention, but Lillian began to laugh at this. Seeing this, the woman became nervous and turned to the girl questioningly. But the heroine laughed even harder and, apologizing to Vanessa, said that she was lying so confidently that she could not hold back her laughter. This outraged the aunt, and she immediately asked if the girl really thought she was lying. And continuing, the woman explained that she had only said what she had heard herself, and that there was no lie here. Lillian replied that in that case Vanessa should not jump to conclusions about those in question, and then the girl asked if she really didn't know anything. After this question, the woman began to pretend that she really didn't know anything, and the heroine was outraged by this, so she said that it was impossible not to understand that someone lived in this room. Then Lillian added that she still understands Vanessa, because she has always been indifferent to the girl's life, and apparently that is why she doesn't know anything. So the main character asked to let her take the initiative into her own hands. After all, Duke Von Hart is the heroine's guest, and she wants to give him a tour on her own. As she was seeing the man off, Lillian thanked him for agreeing to become her guardian. The Duke himself expressed his surprise at such a family, but the girl did not despair and said that she did not know a family in which there were no problems. Having said this, the main character immediately asked Hart when she could come visit him, because now it was her turn to fulfill her promise. To which the Duke responded without hesitation that Lillian could come at any time convenient for her, and the girl was very surprised by this. At that moment, the heroine realized that there were only 6 years left until the death of the young Duke, and she was wondering if the boy was already showing any symptoms, but in any case, Lillian must gradually prepare to commit revenge. The man was about to get into the carriage, but the girl stopped him, saying that she wanted to ask him for another favor. And continuing, the heroine asked if she could stay for a couple of days when she came to the young Duke, because she needed time to examine him thoroughly. At the end of the discussion, Lillian asked the man if he would be against it, since the girl herself was worried that he might refuse her now. But the Duke immediately said that the main character could act at her own discretion, and these words immediately made her eyes shine. And, delighted, the girl thanked Hart and said that she would come to visit with a gift for him. Already in the carriage, the man thought about everything, and it was surprising to him that Lillian wanted to give him a gift. Suddenly, the assistant interrupted the Duke's thoughts and asked how everything went, to which he replied that the girl impressed him very much, because she turned out to be brave. The assistant laughed a little because he knew that Hart was going to take the heroine under his wing anyway, since such a gift could not be bought for a ton of gold. After these words, the man thought for a bit but still agreed with the young man. Moreover, legionnaires are very often deprived of human and spiritual warmth. But when Lillian used her ability on the Duke, a light began to emanate from her body that could melt even the coldest heart, and for a moment he felt like an ordinary person. An ability whose power is self-evident is a very rare and desirable gift. The man himself immediately felt his strength, and he understood at what moment to take a step back and at what moment to apply force. And the main character was ready to negotiate, and today Hart realized that the girl knows how to be decisive and knows when to use it. And while the Duke was pondering his impressions of the meeting, the assistant looked at him questioningly and decided to remind him of one important detail. Continuing, the young man said that although Lillian was still a child, suspicion could not be removed from her. After all, maybe the main character is connected with that very event. The Duke sighed heavily and agreed, since during this time he noticed that the girl knew how to lie. Hart immediately remembered the moment of his conversation with Lillian, where she told him that she had experience communicating with Legionnaires. But the man found this strange, since the girl had lived locked up all her life and had no opportunity to meet a Legionnaire, so he did not understand how she understood her ability so well. Hearing this, the assistant realized that there really was a lot of suspicious stuff about the main character. And so the young man immediately asked the Duke whether he should investigate further. To which the man, after thinking for a bit, responded with consent and said that he would again entrust this to his assistant. After these words, Duke Lieutenant Brandon immediately changed, as he was a Legionnaire with the ability to change appearance. And having transformed, the young man spoke about his excitement, because the target is a man who has lost everything and still continues to fight, but still the young man will try not to disappoint Hart. After finishing, Brandon asked the Duke if his son had returned, since he had recently run away from home, but the man was a little upset by this question, since Hart didn't know anything about this, but even if the boy returned, he still avoided his father at home, which the Duke didn't like, but the assistant immediately explained this behavior by age, saying that it would soon pass. Brandon also thought that perhaps the young Duke was still suffering from what he had seen during the massacre, but he had already decided not to talk about it. The main character's life has changed a lot since Hart visited her. The most noticeable change was the move to new quarters, but this was not Lillian's first time in them. After all, the girl would have been given this room if she had listened to her Uncle Henry in everything. And in her past life, the main character was obedient, and such conditions made her incredibly happy. But now Lillian had other concerns. It was necessary to free the estate from unnecessary people. Having gathered everyone, the girl expressed her surprise at the love of her relatives for her parents and said that she was very pleased that everyone had preserved the bright memory of them. And continuing, the heroine asked the guests whether it was time for them to return to their duties. After all, Lillian's mom and dad told her that all adults always have adult things to do. The girl then expressed her assumption that her parents would not be very pleased that relatives left their duties under the pretext of mourning, which caused them to simply look at her in shock. But it was precisely thanks to this conversation that the heroine kicked out the relatives who had been staying with them for too long from the estate. However, Vanessa and Henry steadfastly responded to all reproaches, but the girl understood that they were representatives of the Fan clan, and they could not be driven out so easily. Suddenly, there was a knock on Lillian's door, saying that they had brought the bouquet she had ordered, and the girl immediately remembered another change. As the atmosphere in the estate cleared up, even the servants who usually ignored the heroine began to treat her very well. And now one of the maids immediately came up and said that, on Lillian's orders, they decorated the interior with flowers given by the Duke, and what could be planted, they planted in the garden. The girl understood that, unlike her stepmother, she was not picky and many of the maids wanted to earn her favor, and now they would have much less work, which they were most likely very happy about. And realizing that she needed allies in this estate, the heroine decided not to push away the servants, so she immediately thanked Samantha for always helping her. Then Lillian asked if the maid was paid well, to which the girl became embarrassed and replied that her salary was enough. The girl herself, establishing contact with everyone, understood that the maids who did not want to be friends with her because of the past would distance themselves from her even more, and it would become obvious from whom to expect betrayal. After all, the main character is the seed of discord that fell between these people, and they just have to wait for her plan to start working. After meeting Lillian, the maids noticed that Samantha had bullied the girl the most, and asked if she was now ashamed to fawn on her. But the girl was indignant and said that this had never happened, and that these accusations were lies. The maid immediately reminded Samantha of the incident when she released rats from the attic into the young lady's room. The others confirmed this because they remembered how that day Lillian ran to complain to her mother, who accused her of lying and beat her. And the maids also remembered that someone had brought the girl some ointment for her bruises, but it definitely wasn't Samantha. After listening to everything, the girl could not stand it any longer and, grabbing her colleague by the hair, began to say that she was no better and also mocked Lillian. But suddenly the door to the room opened, and the servant immediately called everyone to attract attention. And trying to catch her breath, the girl said to stop the fight because the main character fell down the stairs. Everyone immediately turned away from the conflict and looked at their colleague in shock, frozen in place. At this time, the doctor had already bandaged Lillian and warned that the girl would have to refrain from running for a long time. And continuing, the man said that if the fracture had happened higher, everything would have been much worse, but the heroine needed to eat well. Henry accepted the doctor's advice and began to scold the maids, asking why they had not told him that the railing on the stairs was broken. In addition, the man was unhappy that the servants did not greet the doctor, which made the girls blush even more and apologize. But Lillian herself was surprised by Henry's appeal to Vanessa, with the aim of urging her to approach this incident with complete seriousness. And then the man explained that he thought the best solution was to fire all the servants, but the aunt thought that was too cruel. Henry apologized and asked where Vanessa saw cruelty in this decision, to which the woman immediately said that these people had served the Count's lanches for many years, and that one mistake could not simply deprive them of their livelihood. But in fact, Vanessa felt sorry for the money she had bribed the servants with, and Henry, on the contrary, wanted to recruit people loyal to him, so the two of them began to argue, which Lillian really liked. After all, no matter which of the relatives wins, it will in any case be beneficial to the main character, since this is all part of her plan. The main character knew that Henry would be coming soon, so she decided to cause problems for the maids. Everything worked out just as Lillian wanted, and for a while there were no servants to be seen in the corridors at all. And at that moment, the girl had no choice but to not miss this chance and somehow harm herself because she was counting on the girls being blamed for any misfortune that happened while they were busy. This turned out to be an easy task since, like the heroine's shabby room in the past, the railing on the stairs was broken. And while Lillian was thinking about all this, the door to her room opened, to which she immediately turned her attention. One of the servants brought Edmund to the girl and told her about this, while the boy himself was already examining his sister. Vanessa immediately called Edmund to her, and the heroine at that moment was very happy that he was on her side. And the boy, completely ignoring his aunt, approached Lillian and immediately asked about what had happened. The main character said that she admired the flowers and leaned on the railing, which was broken, and that's why she fell. And when Edmund asked where the servants were looking, Lillian said that she called them a couple of times, but they did not come and she assumed that they were busy. Vanessa interrupted the children's conversation at this point and told the boy that because of this incident, Henry now wants to fire all the servants. And continuing, the woman said that if Edmund thought it was too cruel, he should tell him honestly, because he was a young lord and they needed to know his opinion. But the boy reminded them that the victim here was Lillian, and besides, she was the eldest in this family, and they should first of all hear her opinion. Therefore, despite Vanessa's indignation, Edmund immediately turned to his sister, asking what she thought about all this. The heroine was waiting for a convenient opportunity, and was glad that her brother had sped up this process and began to express his opinion on this matter. And as far as Lillian knows, in such cases, after severe beatings, the culprits must be branded with a hot iron, since this is negligence and lack of discipline, and they have the right to send the servants to prison. However, the main character took into account the fact that the girls had served faithfully for several years and considered such a punishment too severe. So the girl said she wanted absolutely everyone to be fired, and while one of the maids had already run to Lillian, the heroine added that everyone should be fired without compensation or recommendations because they were to blame for this incident. Samantha was already kneeling in front of the girl, saying that it was all unfair and begging for mercy, since they had made one small mistake and would now lose absolutely everything. But the main character herself believed that she already pitied the maids more than they deserved. And leaning over, Lillian whispered to Samantha to remember everything they had done, taking out their anger on her. So now the girls should be grateful that they were not punished to the full extent of the law, but were only fired. After these words, the main character immediately looked questioningly at Samantha with a smile, hoping that she understood everything. Already at night, Lillian was heading to her brother, enjoying the silence in the house due to the absence of servants. In addition, the girl now does not need to worry about being noticed and can safely walk around the estate. But the main character didn't like that Edmund didn't want to talk about his leg injury because, judging by how long and hard it was healing, it was something serious. And now Lillian also has a leg injury, so she thought it wouldn't be too noticeable if she took on her brother's injury. Therefore, while Edmund continued to sleep soundly, the main character did not hesitate and began healing. The girl's leg immediately gave way from severe pain, so Lillian could not stand normally for the first few seconds. And trembling from the pain, the heroine assumed that Edmund had a very serious fracture, because everything felt exactly like that. Already moving away, the girl realized that her guesses were correct, and therefore she only needed to be patient a little longer. But just as Lillian was about to leave quietly, Edmund crouched down and grabbed her hand. And looking at the main character with confusion, the boy asked what she was doing. Trying to fully wake up, Edmund continued to wonder what had happened and where the bright light had gone. Lillian nervously replied that she simply saw a rat run into her brother's room, and that's why she came in. The boy immediately panicked, and taking the heroine by the shoulders, began to ask again, hoping that this was not true. But from such physical pressure and pain from the fracture, the girl was unable to stay on her feet and fell to the floor. Edmund became worried and, asking questions, got out of bed, which immediately made him freeze in shock. And while the boy was trying to figure out what was wrong with him, Lillian replied that she was fine. Her legs just suddenly gave way and asked for help to get up. And when Edmund asked what she had done to him, since his legs no longer hurt at all, the heroine asked again, since she did not understand what they were talking about. Helping his sister, the boy explained that although he was sleeping, he was awakened by a bright light and, opening his eyes, he saw her in front of him. That's why Edmund was very interested in what the main character did to him. Lillian immediately became tense, as she did not want to reveal her abilities right away. But after thinking a little, the girl realized that she could trust her brother, so she decided to tell the truth. After these words, the main character expressed her assumptions that she has the gift of the Legion. Edmund was taken aback by this and asked again, since he had not noticed any signs in Lillian before. The girl replied that perhaps it was a congenital anomaly, but her brother had never heard of such a thing and considered it impossible. The main character, having begun her transformation, explained that her abilities had only recently manifested themselves. And Edmund, watching the process in surprise, could not say anything and simply stood silently. A few seconds later, Lillian completely changed her appearance and continued her speech, saying that she was a unique specimen. The boy stood there, illuminated by the light from the wings, trying to find words, while the heroine herself asked if he understood what she was talking about. And turning his head slightly, Edmund replied that he understood that the girl was a unique specimen, and therefore everything was a little different. When Lillian asked him not to tell anyone that she was a Legionnaire and had cured him, the boy said that he knew everything and would not tell, because if anyone found out about it, she would be in danger. The main character was immediately glad that her brother was really smart, but Edmund began to understand the rest, so he asked if she had fallen down the stairs on purpose. Continuing, the young lord noted that now that all the servants were dismissed, their aunt had lost her spies, which meant everything would be simpler. Then the boy asked if the main character could heal herself, to which she looked at him in surprise. And after thinking, Lillian explained that this was impossible, but she had a strong regenerative ability, so after sleep she would feel much better. Hearing this, Edmund handed the girl his painkiller, because she had cured him and he no longer needed it, and besides, the boy really wanted to help his sister. The heroine immediately remembered the moment when she once saw rats in her room and ran to complain to her stepmother, but she did not believe her and beat her with a cane, and that day someone secretly put ointment for bruises in her room. So now, looking at her brother with warmth, Lillian thought that it was he who brought her the ointment back then. So the main character took the medicine without hesitation, thanking the boy. Already sitting alone, Edmund examined his leg and was surprised that there was almost nothing left of the injury. But still, the young lord understood that such a sudden healing would arouse suspicion, so he decided that it was better to pretend to be ill for a while longer. And having thought everything over, the only thing the boy was unhappy with was his sister's excuse about the rats, because he was very scared. Edmund also, for some reason, remembered the day when he sat with his mother on a bench and wondered why she treated Lillian so badly. Continuing, the boy said that the heroine really did have a rat in her room, and that she wasn't lying. But the woman still stood her ground. The Countess also said that Lillian's mother had taken away from her everything that was rightfully hers, so it didn't matter whether the girl was lying or telling the truth. Besides, the woman is now the main character's mother, so she believed that she had every right to punish her. And in conclusion, the Countess said that at the moment, everything is as it should be and everyone knows their place. But Edmund still thought differently and came with ointment to his sister's room, where she lay and cried in pain. After all, the boy, although he knew that the girl's mother had taken everything from the Countess, did not understand that Lillian herself was to blame. The young lord was also interested in why the woman was taking the main character away from him, limiting communication, because now the sister even told Edmund that she was a legionnaire and healed him, despite everything that happened in the past. And continuing to remember all the last moments with Lillian, the boy realized that it was quite fair for her to hate him. In the morning, Henry walked around the estate singing songs, enjoying the wonderful sunny day. Approaching his niece's door, the man immediately knocked and began calling her by name. The heroine herself did not hesitate and abruptly opened the door, hitting her uncle in the face, and he winced in pain. Lillian was surprised by such an early visit and asked the purpose. The man, holding his nose, replied that he thought she wanted to talk. And continuing, Henry asked if the girl was comfortable without servants, because he, as their and Edmund's guardian, had to hire servants for them. But before the uncle could finish speaking, the heroine interrupted him and said that they had already sorted this out. Lillian also said that she was going to visit because Duke von Hart had business with her. Henry was very interested in this, and he noted that as a guardian, he should also go, but the girl immediately refused, explaining that she did not want to go with him. Hearing the refusal, the man became upset and asked the reason why Lillian was so reluctant for him to go. And the main character explained that the Duke had invited only her, and if she came with her uncle, Hart would think that she was afraid. Continuing, the girl added that the von Harts hated cowards and liars, so if Henry continued to insist on his own, then Lillian would do everything to ensure that he was no longer her guardian. After these words, the man immediately left, and the heroine, smiling, looked after him, because in fact she simply does not want him to follow her. But still, Lillian didn't like the fact that because of Henry she couldn't talk to Edmund, and now she tried to calm herself down with the fact that the boy was still sleeping. The carriage was supposed to arrive soon, so the main character was already getting ready to get out to go to the Duke. And to Lillian's surprise, Edmund was already waiting for her at the carriage. So, while the girl stood in shock, her brother asked if she was going to von Hart, to which the heroine said that she would return in a few days, but the boy did not need to worry about her. Continuing, Lillian unexpectedly asked Edmund if he had thought about entering the academy, because the girl herself understood that while she was changing the future here, her brother needed to find a safe place away from home. And the young lord agreed to his sister's proposal without hesitation, which shocked her. That's why the heroine immediately asked the boy why he didn't even think about it, and Edmund explained that if she wanted, he would go to study. Lillian immediately leaned closer to her brother and asked him to think about it, because it was just a suggestion, and she respected his opinion. But the boy, saying that he understood everything, did not change his decision. The main character became confused and tense from such a confident answer, because Edmund might now think that she was trying to kick him out. Already sitting in the carriage and recalling the entire dialogue, Lillian did not understand why her brother did not want to have a good relationship with her. And in response to the heroine's desire to be a good sister, the boy said that there was no need for this, since he did not want to be a burden to her. And the young lord continued to say the same thing about studying, and that he agreed to enter the academy since he believed that his sister really needed it. And despite the fact that Lillian understood that Edmund respected her opinion very much, she felt somehow uneasy, and the girl assumed that it was because she had changed. While the main character was thinking about everything, the carriage reached the estate of Duke von Hart, which the coachman immediately informed her about. As she exited the vehicle, Lillian realized that now was not the time to think about Edmund, because she had more important things to do here. After all, the Duke is the only salvation for the heroine and her brother from their relatives, but still the man scared the girl a little, and in her opinion, the glasses did not suit him at all. Despite everything, Lillian, having crossed the threshold, immediately bowed and greeted von Hart. The Duke immediately noticed the girl's leg and asked what had happened, which made her a little worried, as she had not thought it was so noticeable and wanted to pretend that nothing had happened. In the end, the main character said that she accidentally twisted her ankle, but there was nothing serious about it. After these words, the man silently began to approach Lillian, and she stood and did not understand his actions. Coming up, the Duke immediately picked up the girl in his arms and asked why she walked away from the carriage herself, since it was completely unnecessary. And while von Hart carried the heroine to the right room, she sat on her hands and stared blankly at one point. Lillian was in a very strong shock, and therefore, even when the Duke sat her down on the sofa, she continued to not move and try to understand what had just happened. At this time, the man sat down opposite and asked the servants to bring a treat for the main character. Hearing this, Lillian immediately came to her senses as she remembered the gift she had brought with her. And then the girl immediately asked for forgiveness and handed the Duke a small box. When Hart asked what it was, the heroine said that it was the promised gift, namely, a homemade, very tasty dessert. After these words, the man looked sternly at Lillian and assumed that the girl thought that he would not show hospitality and feed her. The main character immediately began to deny this and explained that she simply loved this particular dessert, and that was why she decided to give it to the Duke. But looking at Von Hart's reaction, Lillian was upset because she thought that he didn't like her, and also, the girl heard that sharing is more pleasant than eating everything alone. The Duke was a little shocked by these words because he didn't expect that the heroine would want to eat together and would be upset now because of this, so he still said that he might join later. Lillian, not hearing full consent in the answer, decided to put aside a piece for the young lord so as not to throw it away. And continuing, the heroine sadly began to ask for something for dessert, since the Duke did not want to eat with her yet. But the man interrupted the girl and asked the servant to bring 2 saucers for dessert, at which point she happily repeated his words. Then Hart also said to serve tea of Lillian's choice, and she added and asked for another tea of the Duke's choice. Von Hart himself, looking at the main character, realized that the girl was quite assertive and would not give up so easily. And smiling, the Duke thought with complete confidence that Lillian was, after all, a legionnaire. As soon as the table was set, everyone immediately began to eat. The main character ate and watched Hart, mentally rejoicing that he had finally agreed to eat with her. After all, at first the man did not express any desire, but now he even liked it, and he eats his piece with pleasure. So Lillian was immediately convinced that there was nothing better than food to lift her spirits and decided to get down to business. The heroine said that at first she thought of bringing dessert from the kitchen of their mansion, but problems arose at home. And when the Duke asked for details, the girl realized that he already knew everything, but was pretending, because the man was aware of what was happening in the Lanches estate. But Lillian continued anyway and explained that all the servants had been fired for negligence and that new people were currently being recruited, so the estate's economy was at a standstill. So the main character, having finished, asked the Duke to recommend them a good servant, because any people he approved would suit them. The man agreed without hesitation, since this task was not difficult for him. And Lillian was very happy with this answer, because now Uncle Henry would be out of work and would not be able to recruit his own people as servants. Then the girl, wanting to begin the treatment, asked if the young lord was at home and if he had left the room. Hart said the boy was at home, but was in his quarters and did not come out at all. And continuing, the Duke expressed his joy that yesterday he had found his son and brought him to the estate, but the heroine did not quite understand these words and became thoughtful. The man also warned Lillian about the young lord's condition, because it was not very good, and so he asked if the girl really wanted to see him, because the boy needs time to calm down, and he has not yet recovered from the energy overload. But the main character asked the Duke not to worry, because she could handle it, and the man himself was shocked by such a confident answer, because he thought that she would be scared. Lillian happily finished her dessert and added, saying that, after all, she was the best at healing. Already in the room, Karen looked at the main character with confusion and, leaning his hand against the wall, the young lord began to address Lillian. The boy asked what was wrong with the girl, which made the heroine tense up, since, despite her confident words, she didn't think that everything would turn out like this. But as he looked at Lillian, waiting for an answer, Karen caught himself thinking. So the young lord asked if they had met before, which immediately made the girl think and try to figure out if this was the boy she had met in the alley. And a second later, Lillian was shocked, because remembering the stranger's face, she was convinced that it was him. But still, the heroine did not understand everything that was happening, since the Duke's previously promised words were fulfilled in a different way. The man was supposed to escort Lillian to her room, but instead he sent a servant with her. However, the employee himself did not take us to the room itself, but only to the door. And the heroine at that moment realized that she would have to figure everything out on her own, and so, heading towards the room, she began to think everything over. But suddenly, a young lord approached the girl and stretched out his hand towards her, which frightened her, and already pressing Lillian against the wall, the boy asked about the purpose of the visit, while the girl herself did not understand why he was so close. That's why the heroine immediately asked Karen to move away a little and not stand so close. The young lord was shocked by this request because Lillian had previously been more polite to him. The main character herself was pleased that she now knew that the stranger was the only son of Duke von Hart, Karen von Hart. Lillian then expressed a desire to formally introduce herself and said that she had come to assist with the treatment. Continuing, the girl bowed and said that her name was Lillian Delanches. And looking up at Karen, the main character added that she did not expect to meet the young lord here again. But after these words, the boy frowned and looked sternly at his guest. After all, Karen thought that Lillian was his father's maid, and that was why they had seen each other before, but the heroine only asked again in shock. And continuing his indignation, the young lord expressed his displeasure at the fact that she dared to enter his room without permission. Then Karen clenched his fist and asked the heroine if she really thought that he would let down his guard, and if that was the case, then he would have to report on every step. At that moment, the young duke had a tense aura about him, which made Lillian realize that Hart hadn't told his son anything, and now it seemed like she was some kind of spy. Therefore, it is not surprising that even earlier the girl found this situation strange, because when she and the Duke stood at his son's door and discussed the presence of a man during the treatment process, he immediately refused. And Lillian was very surprised that the Duke would not even check her and whether she was doing everything right. But as it turned out, the son hates his father, and therefore he will immediately run away upon seeing Duke Hart. The heroine noticed this during their previous conversation and realized that the relationship between the man and Karen was not simple. However, now Lillian was still outraged, because everything could have been explained normally. But the girl's thoughts were interrupted by the young lord, because she saw that his condition had worsened. And the heroine immediately tried to calm the boy down, while she took his cheek with her hand to check his temperature, which turned out to be high. Karen grabbed Lillian's hand and wanted to move it away from her face, but the girl already understood that the rollback process had begun. Because of his anger, the boy has accumulated energy that no longer fits within him. So, taking the young lord by the hand, Lillian pulled him towards the bed so that he could lie down. However, Karen was outraged by what was happening and demanded an explanation, not wanting to listen to the girl. Lillian climbed up to the boy and touched his forehead, saying that she had come to help, and immediately changed her appearance. Karen himself was shocked by what he saw, because after her touch he also felt better. The torment that drove the young lord mad and the destructive impulse that made him thirst for blood disappeared without a trace. At that moment, the main character fell right onto Karen out of helplessness, having used up all her strength. The boy, having caught Lillian, stared in shock at one point while she lay motionless on top. But looking at the heroine, the young lord had even more questions about everything that was happening. While trying to lift the girl, Karen noticed that she continued to not move at all, which made him even more shocked. And putting Lillian on the bed, the young lord asked if she was okay, but the heroine did not react in any way. The boy assumed that the heroine was sleeping, but still could not believe that after everything she fell asleep so quickly. So, poking the girl in the cheek, Karen tried to determine whether she was deceiving him, because otherwise he would have to turn to his father. And having made sure that Lillian was really asleep, the young lord sighed heavily and got ready to go to the Duke. At this time, the assistant asked Hart about Karen and Lillian, to which he said that they would see if the girl could cure his son. Brandon noted that in any case, while checks were being conducted in the palace, it was better not to stick his head out. Moreover, the main character does not want anyone to know about her, to which the Duke immediately agreed. After all, there had already been a conversation about this earlier, when Hart and Lillian were sitting together and drinking tea. The man wondered why the girl did not go to the imperial palace, despite having such abilities. And the heroine immediately explained that she would not have enough strength to defend herself, and if the palace found out about her gift, she would be sent to the battlefield. But Lillian really wants to go to war, because then her plan will not come true. But the heroine hates it even more when she is used. And thinking about everything, the Duke realized that the girl's words were quite clear and therefore not subject to doubt. The lieutenant continued and said that they would have problems too if they were caught, and the imperial family would never miss an opportunity to take such a legionnaire. But Hart replied that they could arouse suspicion, but the young man did not understand and asked again in surprise. After these words, the doors of the Duke's office suddenly opened, which greatly shocked the man. Brandon also turned around and asked what was going on. And seeing Karen, the young man was no less surprised than Von Hart himself. The young lord walked purposefully towards his father's table, demanding an explanation. Karen was interested in the identity of the girl who had just been in the room with him and had used magic. After some time, the main character woke up and tried to understand where she was. And looking at the ceiling, Lillian found it unfamiliar, which caused even more questions. But the girl realized that she had lost consciousness while treating Karen and wanted to lie down a little longer, when suddenly the Duke sitting next to her said that he was glad that she had woken up. Lillian immediately opened her eyes and looked at Hart in shock. As soon as the heroine realized that she was in the Duke's estate, she immediately sat down, but the man told her not to get up. Then the Duke said that the girl had slept for 3 whole days since she had treated Karen. Lillian was shocked by this information and could not believe that so much time had passed, and since the heroine was fast asleep, Hart periodically came and visited her. The Duke inquired about Lillian's condition, and the heroine immediately demonstrated her good condition, saying that she could even run a marathon. However, this did not sound so convincing, so the man asked the girl if he could believe her words. After all, before this, the heroine also said that her legs were fine, but in reality everything turned out differently, and now she explained that since she can walk, there is no need to worry. But while Lillian smiled in the hope that they would believe her, Hart's expression didn't even change. And then the Duke asked whether Lillian had been treated before, to which the heroine's smile immediately changed its meaning. Hart continued and said that doctors came and said that after the accident it would take a couple more months to recover. Hearing this, Lillian immediately tensed up because she realized that the Duke had already noticed everything. At that moment, the man told the girl that from now on she would only treat his son, and the heroine agreed, since there was no one else to whom she could show her abilities. But Lillian had a feeling that she had forgotten something, and besides that, she had doubts about the possibility of curing Karen. After all, the young lord was quite strong and his body could not resist. However, if Lillian continues to support the boy's power, he will be able to grow up peacefully and learn to control his abilities. And Hart was sure that the heroine would be able to save his son from being absorbed by the Force. The girl told the man that Karen knew nothing about her and asked if he had told him about everything. But the Duke replied that he did not consider it necessary, and the girl immediately became indignant. The man continued and reminded Lillian of the massacre that had happened 6 years ago. And at first, the girl did not understand the reason for the start of this conversation. But then the Duke said that Karen saw everything with his own eyes. The main character was very surprised and did not understand what the young lord was doing there. And then the boy told his father words that he remembered very well. That day, Karen told the man that he had received a lot of help, and the savior was a fair-haired girl with pink eyes. The heroine immediately remembered that besides her, there was only one other person with such a rare combination of colors. And that person, Lillian's mother, is Chloe Lanches. Realizing this, the girl was surprised and assumed that her mother had her own secret. Hart continued and said that the Legionnaires are obsessed, and as soon as they notice someone similar, they cling to them with all their might. And Lillian reminds the Duke of that woman, so he decided that he didn't need to introduce her to his son in advance. After all, the man was sure that there would be no problems because of his appearance, but in the end, everything turned out differently, and the young lord became very angry. The Duke said that thanks to Lillian, Karen is learning to overcome difficulties, which he is very happy about. So Hart decided to thank the heroine and said he hoped it would continue that way. And Lillian at that moment felt a pleasant sensation inside and understood what it was like to help others. And smiling, the girl reminded them that this is exactly what she was talking about and that they would not regret her help. When he finished, the Duke called Lillian to dinner, assuming that she would have become hungry after 3 days. And since dinner was already ready, Von Hart and the girl simply went down to the table, where she immediately began to eat. Everything was so delicious that it even melted in her mouth, and Lillian enjoyed it more than it satisfied her hunger. After all, it had been a long time since the heroine had eaten without worrying about poison, since there was a fear of poisoning in the Duke's estate. And Lillian had been stuffing herself with the poison called alcohol for a long time. But here you don't have to worry about that because the heroine is well taken care of and protected. The Duke and the Duke's men tended to Lillian when she passed out while saving his son, and the man himself looked after her all night. But looking at Hart, the girl saw something that looked very much like a cigarette and was very surprised. The heroine immediately began to think about how harmful tobacco smoke is, but when the man pulled the candy out of his mouth, Lillian was taken aback and asked about it, and the Duke said that his wife hated the smell of tobacco, so he didn't smoke. Hearing this, the heroine thought about the man's fidelity, since the Duchess had been gone for a long time, but he still thought about her. But Von Hart interrupted the girl's thoughts by asking if she wanted more food. Lillian immediately remembered the day when Karen behaved just like his father and realized that they were very similar. The heroine then asked if the Duke could recommend a servant for the Lanches estate, as she was concerned about what had happened at home while she lay unconscious. However, the man immediately asked Lillian not to worry, because he called on those who can work quickly and keep their mouths shut, and they most likely already did their job without leaving a trace. These words shocked the girl because she thought that Hart had sent not servants to the estate, but killers. So Lillian asked what the Duke meant, and he explained that the staff had already finished dusting and doing other housekeeping chores. And the man guarantees that when Lillian returns home, she will not find a single speck of dust there, and the staff of servants will be minimal. Lillian immediately exhaled as she realized that they were talking about cleaning, and in fact, everything was fine and no one was killed. Duke Hart decided to ask if the heroine fainted every time she used her abilities, but the girl couldn't answer and said that they could check it the next time she treated Karen again. Lillian herself doubts this because she uses her abilities too often. And so the heroine assumed that the problem was that she couldn't heal external wounds, because when she treated Karen, the sensations were completely different. But the Duke began to insist that the heroine remain with them in the estate if she needed rest after each treatment. Lillian decided to ask Hart again, to which he explained that in this way they could avoid unnecessary suspicions. However, the Duke is only a guardian for Lillian, and even if he took on the responsibility of providing for her, if she stayed for a long time, it could lead to problems. But the man explained that if the heroine agreed to the engagement, then all questions would be removed, which immediately shocked her. And seeing this, the Duke immediately asked whether Lillian herself had not said that she wanted to take advantage of everything they had. Lillian herself couldn't help but be surprised, because she and Karen should have been asked about this in advance. But suddenly a servant came and asked the Duke to take a break, whispering this in his ear. Hart immediately stood up from his chair and said that they would discuss everything else later, which surprised the heroine. But before the girl had time to say anything, the Duke announced that he had assigned her a personal maid. After these words, a girl approached Lillian and introduced herself as Olivia, Lillian's personal maid. The heroine greeted him in return and asked him to take care of her during her presence, to which the maid immediately bowed. Lillian thought the maid's name sounded very familiar, but she couldn't remember where she had heard it. The maid decided to ask what the girl wanted, to which she immediately said that she wanted to go for a walk. However, Olivia was sure that Lillian would not be able to walk for a long time because of her sore legs, so she offered to carry her on her back, but the heroine immediately refused. The girl then explained that she had been fine since waking up, and Olivia was a little surprised, but she remained silent. And only after a couple of seconds, the maid said that since Lillian was confident in her condition, she would collect everything for the walk. Walking through Duke von Hart's garden, the main character admired its beauty. While Olivia was talking about beautiful places, Lillian looked at her and remembered the words about how she was very physically strong. And it was very unexpected for the girl to hear this from the maid, because usually everything is a little different. Thinking about it, Lillian assumed that all of the Duke's servants had special talents, but still, for the heroine, this was not very important, since the main thing was that Olivia was a good and friendly maid. But suddenly, the ladies' walk was interrupted by shouts and requests to immediately leave the road nearby, to which they immediately paid attention. The main character stood there, confused, looking towards the source of the sound, trying to understand what was happening. The white-haired girl angrily and screamingly asked the servants how they dared to stand in her way. Continuing, the heroine began to threaten the employees to rot in prison for the rest of their days if they continued to interfere with her. The girl also said that the guards had no right to treat her like that because she was the princess of the empire and the bride of the young Duke von Hart. These words shocked Lillian greatly because just a few minutes earlier Hart had proposed to her to marry his son. The princess's name was Gloria Limbrana, and she was one of the emperor's 3 heirs. Gloria was the beloved daughter of the entire family and the only legionary of royal blood. The girl is popular and much loved by the people. However, Lillian remembers absolutely nothing from her past life about her engagement to the young Duke. Therefore, now the main character assumed that the engagement took place in secret from everyone. At this time, one of the guards asked for forgiveness from the princess and explained that he could not let her in, since the Duke had not announced that he was expecting guests. But Gloria didn't notify von Hart, she just came as soon as she learned that the young lord had returned home. And the girl's maid also entered into the dialogue, saying that no matter how high the status of the Duke at court, he was still only a nobleman, and they were obliged to let a person of royal blood through. But the guards stood their ground and said that they obeyed only the Duke, to which the woman asked to call him to them. Hart himself was not at home, and the maid, with even greater displeasure, shouted that in that case they should at least inform the prince that the princess had arrived. At this point, Lillian turned to Olivia and asked if Gloria was really engaged to the young lord. And the girl said that she didn't know why the princess's family decided this way, but von Hart had not made any decisions about Karen's engagement to her highness. So Gloria is simply unrequitedly in love with the young Duke, and that is why she says so. The main character initially considered this option impossible, but remembering the boy's character, her opinion immediately changed. The princess had already noticed Lillian and was looking at her without taking her eyes off her. Seeing this, the heroine immediately became dissatisfied that Her Highness was looking at her so intently. At this point, the girl couldn't stand it any longer and pointed her finger at Lillian, asking who she was. Continuing, Gloria said that judging by the way Lillian was dressed, she was not from the Duke's family, so the princess assumed that she was visiting him. But Olivia immediately denied this assumption and said that Von Hart took guardianship over the main character. Gloria was even more angered by this news and asked again why she didn't know anything about the girl. The princess then turned to Lillian in an insulting manner, ordering her to come closer. The main character did not like this attitude towards herself, because even though Gloria is a royal person, good manners must be present. And while Lillian was unhappy with what was happening, the princess's maid was indignant about why she still hadn't listened to the order and come over. Olivia, seeing her mistress's tension, asked if she wanted to come over, to which the girl thought about it. After all, Lillian would have liked to ask the servant for help, but she assumed that if she did not obey, the princess would complain to the Duke. And then the heroine's situation will become even worse, so she will now have to somehow cope on her own. So, realizing that she had no choice, Lillian slowly walked towards Gloria. Olivia, looking after her, was already waiting to see what the main character was capable of. As soon as the girl approached the princess, she immediately sternly asked her name. And having bowed, the heroine introduced herself and said that she was the eldest daughter of the late Count Lanches. Gloria immediately thought about it and realized that she was hearing such a name for the first time and assumed that the girl was the heiress to the Count's estate. The princess also asked if Lillian was a legionnaire like her, but the main character answered negatively to all assumptions and questions. Hearing this, Gloria frowned, but the girl herself, smiling, hoped that she would be distracted by someone else. Finally, the princess broke the silence and said that she would do Lillian the honor of joining her for tea. But this made the heroine very wary, since she understood that in this way Gloria was trying to get into the estate, and if she invited the girl into the house as a guest, the guards would have no choice but to let her in. And yet, when the princess asked again whether Lillian was planning to refuse her, the main character politely agreed. After all, it was not at all advantageous for the girl to quarrel with the imperial family now, so she could not disagree. After some time, the main character was already sitting with the princess and drinking tea. Gloria, sitting opposite, noted with a smile that today was a great day for Lillian's not very noble family. And continuing, the girl gave the heroine permission to brag about this event to her parents when she returned home. Lillian also spoke about the death of her mother and father, and added that she really hoped that they would be proud of her, even like this. Gloria found this answer unexpected and expressed great regret about it. The main character herself was surprised by the princess's reaction because she thought that she was an ordinary legionnaire. But the girl, it turns out, knows how to empathize, and this is not typical for people with the gift of the legion. However, Gloria interrupted Lillian's thoughts and demanded to explain what kind of relationship she had with the son of Duke von Hart, but the heroine immediately said that there was nothing between them. The princess was a little taken aback and asked again, asking whether Lillian was familiar with the young lord, to which she became worried and answered negatively. At that moment, the main character realized that she had been very wrong about showing empathy. A few minutes later, the door to the room opened and the maid, apologizing for the wait, began to enter. As soon as the woman approached the table, she immediately started pouring tea for the princess and said so. Then the maid turned her gaze to the main character and asked if she needed some tea too, but at that very moment, the woman trips over a cart with dishes and barely stays on her feet. However, the teapot with tea and all the treats began to fall down, and the only thing the servant managed to do was to warn. At this time, the young lord was training and honing his skills. The young people watching the class discussed and were surprised that Karen had been training for more than 2 hours, and one of the young men suggested that the boy was homesick and perhaps trying to make up for lost time. His partner immediately replied that he could understand the young lord, but he was still confused by the fact that the legionnaire could withstand this without any particular problems. After all, Ethan, who fought with the young lord, was quite a strong opponent. But for Karen, the whole fight felt completely different, and he asked the boy to add more fury to make the training more difficult. Ethan was a little taken aback and noted that the young lord's mood was completely different today, to which he became indignant and began to deny it. However, the boy's expression suddenly changed and he began to look around. Karen immediately asked what had happened, to which Ethan said that for a moment he seemed to feel his mother Olivia's gaze. At that very moment, a servant ran up and began shouting for the little Duke. And while Ethan was still looking around, the man said that he had an important message. Continuing, the servant began to talk about the arrival of Princess Gloria, but the boy, blushing, immediately interrupted him because he already knew everything. Then Karen thought about it and assumed that the princess was pursuing him because he had persistently courted her since childhood. But now everything had changed, and he was disgusted even to hear her name. But the servant interrupted the boy's thoughts and shocked him by informing him that Lillian had invited Gloria to tea at the estate. The young lord, having called the main character a potato, asked again because he did not believe what was said. And while Karen continued to call the girl a boiled potato, Ethan stood and wondered why he gave her such a nickname. Karen didn't hesitate and told the boy that they needed to finish training for today. And when Ethan asked if he was leaving him again, the young lord answered in the negative and explained that he needed to save Lillian, otherwise the princess would turn her into mashed potatoes. Hearing this, Ethan was surprised by Karen's concern for the heroine, because before the princess had not even looked at the boy, after all the attempts at courtship. To which Karen explained that everything happened this way because Gloria was very similar to her parents, and after these words, the hero realized that she would be jealous even if he told her the truth about their first meeting with Lillian. But since the young lord's abilities have awakened, he no longer thinks about the princess, and she will now tell him everything about his acquaintance with the count's daughter. Having finished his thoughts, the boy asked to be taken to Lillian, because he realized that if Gloria started to plan something bad, it would be serious. At this time, the main character sat and looked at her dress, which was soaked in tea, trying to understand what had just happened. The maid immediately began to apologize and say that all this did not happen on purpose and it was not her fault. But Lillian thought about it and realized that the woman had taken advantage of the fact that Olivia was not around because she had gone after the Duke. The princess's maid also drove away all the servants in the house and insisted on serving the girls at tea. And analyzing all this, the main character became completely convinced that everything was not without reason. So while the woman was trying to calm Lillian down, she realized that the tea party was nothing more than an excuse, since they just wanted her to help them meet the young Duke. So, without delay, the girl took her cup and hit the maid in the face with it, which immediately made her angry. And the princess herself watched this in shock and already mentally asked for forgiveness from Lillian for underestimating her. At that very moment, Gloria's gaze became very interested, and she continued to continuously watch what was happening. The main character apologized to the woman, saying that she also did it by accident, but the heroine herself was already preparing a plan for revenge. Continuing, the girl suggested that the maid was angry when she saw the princess humiliate herself and did not even realize what she was doing. Lillian also noted that servants are a reflection of their master and expressed her surprise that the princess's maid behaved this way. At that moment, Karen entered the room and immediately showed his displeasure, saying that he had only just woken up and the girls were already making noise. But suddenly, the young lord's attention was drawn to Lillian in a wet dress, who froze in place in surprise. And turning his gaze to the tea stain, the boy immediately became worried and headed towards the heroine. Gloria, getting up from the sofa, ran to Karen, but he completely ignored her and asked Lillian about the reason for such an appearance. After all, the main character reminded the young lord of a boiled potato, but the girl did not like this comparison, and she began to deny it. The main character also noticed that the boy came without Olivia and was surprised that he was looking for her without any requests from other people. At this point, Gloria interrupted the guys and asked to clarify whether this was really their first meeting. After all, it seemed to the princess that they were quite close for strangers and had clearly seen each other before. After these words, Lillian tensed up a little and began to think about what was happening. And from the expression on the main character's face, the princess realized that she had lied to her and that she and Karen had already met, to which she nervously agreed. Lillian herself, although she realized that she had deceived Gloria, did not think that she and the young lord would meet right away. Now, if the girl tries to explain, she will only make the princess even more angry, and that is not worth doing. Therefore, the heroine said that this was almost the first meeting, and she herself realized that no matter what, it was better to trust the wisdom of Prince von Hart. And Lillian immediately explained that she was under the Duke's care, and that she and Karen simply crossed paths at the estate. Then the girl turned her gaze to the young lord in the hope of support, and he, although he did not understand what was happening, confirmed her words. But Gloria found it all strange, because she knew that the prince didn't care about others at all. So the princess couldn't understand why Karen was so worried about some girl. And thinking about this, Gloria assumed that the main character was dear to the boy and asked if this was really so. But the young lord did not like this assumption, and he immediately responded negatively, calling it nonsense. Karen then asked the princess what she was doing on their estate, which shocked Lillian, who was standing nearby, because she knew that such a thing could not be said to a member of the imperial family. Gloria was unhappy with this question and said that she had done nothing wrong. But the boy, pointing to the scattered dishes, asked who had done all this, if not the princess. And Gloria immediately turned her attention to her maid Eva and said that she was to blame for everything, which immediately made the woman worried. After these words, Karen looked at the servant and asked again to convince her, but she immediately replied that it happened by accident. However, the young lord did not believe it and asked Eva to speak frankly, because if she lied, she would be left without a tongue, to which the woman continued to say that she did not do it on purpose. And the maid herself hoped for the support of her mistress, since there was no evidence that this was not accidental, and if Gloria supported her, then Lillian would definitely not do anything. But the princess confidently and without hesitation told how she saw Eva deliberately drop the tea set. The woman was outraged by such a statement made towards her, so she asked again, and Gloria said that she was disappointed in her because she did the wrong thing. And continuing, the princess added that she herself would never have spilled tea on the young lady, but Karen was already tired of all this and asked to take Eva away. However, the maid began to scream in panic, calling this decision unfair since there was no evidence. Gloria was angered by these words and asked the woman how she dared not believe the words of a member of the royal family and demand proof. And not hearing an answer, the princess said that since Eva dared to dishonor her dignity, she no longer needed her. After some time, Karen told the main character that she knew nothing at all, and that in fact the princess was very careless, so he was glad that she left. The boy also noticed that Gloria's maid had gotten into trouble and assumed that the girl had run away because she was afraid of the Duke. But Lillian was curious about why Karen was saying all this while standing outside the door, and the maid explained that it was awkward for him to come inside while the lady was washing. Then the girls immediately began to discuss the young lord's concern for the main character and were touched by it, because usually he is cold to everyone. Lillian was also surprised, but she understood that she and Karen would have to see each other many more times. Therefore, the best solution for the heroine would be to build a good relationship with the boy. The young lord, catching Lillian's gaze, looked back questioningly and asked what she needed, and the girl immediately thanked Karen for helping her, since she had forgotten to do so earlier. But Karen called this help a trifle and warned the main character that if she continued to walk like that, she would have problems with her legs. Hearing this, Lillian asked if the boy was worried about her, to which he immediately began to actively deny it. The heroine was a little upset and asked if what the young lord was telling her was true, but Karen was very embarrassed, so he looked at the girl in confusion and did not answer. Then the boy decided to change the subject and, turning away, said that he didn't mean that at all, and this interested the heroine even more. And continuing, Karen gave Lillian advice, telling her that if she wanted a quiet life, then she shouldn't get involved with this family. To which the main character replied that she was already under the Duke's care, but the young lord still insisted and advised her to ask to return everything as it was as soon as she felt better. After all, although Karen didn't know why Lillian was his father's servant, he told her not to trust Duke von Hart. However, the girl asked again, explaining that she was not stupid enough to blindly obey. And the young lord told that on the day of the massacre, Duke Hart killed not only the legionnaires, but also his mother. That day, the guy's conversation ended there, and time passed unnoticed at the Duke's estate, and the main character had to return home. Seeing that Lillian was already getting ready, Olivia asked if she was leaving today. The girl immediately confirmed this, but said that she first needed to meet with Hart, because she had not seen him since the morning. However, turning her gaze to the door, the heroine asked if this was definitely the Duke's office, and the maid agreed, assuming that he should be there. Lillian immediately paused to think, as it seemed to her that the door to the office had recently been repaired. That's why the girl became a little tense, because most likely someone was trying to get inside. As soon as the main character went to the Duke, he immediately showed her the letters that Henry had been sending him all this time. And while Lillian was surprised by the number, Hart said the man still continues to send him letters, although he has not responded to any of them. The girl began to read everything, and the message of what was written did not surprise her at all, since Henry was upset that his plans had failed. Having finished, the heroine asked if anyone else had written, to which the Duke replied in the negative, suggesting that she was expecting a letter from someone else. And Lillian agreed, because she thought that her brother would send her a letter, and now she is a little worried. Because in the Von Hart mansion, everything is fine with the main character, but Edmund, unfortunately, is still locked up among his relatives. So after thinking about it, the girl said that she wanted to send her brother to the academy. The man decided to clarify to make sure he had not misheard. And Lillian immediately happily confirmed, and then proudly said that her brother was very smart and he should study at the academy. The main character also promised that Edmund would be the best in the class, would achieve success, and would definitely thank her. However, the Duke did not answer and simply stared at one point, which made the girl a little upset, although she expected such a reaction. But still, Lillian really hoped for help, because she didn't have much power, and if she sent her brother to the academy, he would finally be free from his relatives. And while the heroine was lost in her thoughts, Von Hart thought it all over and called her idea about Edmund's studies not bad and said that he would think about this issue some more. Hearing this, the girl immediately began to thank the man and calling him the best, already reaching out to hug him. But the Duke, instead of reciprocating, looked in great shock at the approaching Lillian. The main character was immediately confused by this look and realized that she had come too close, but she didn't even understand how. So the girl, stuttering a little, asked for forgiveness, but Hart said that everything was fine and that he should be thanking her. And continuing, the man noted that Lillian had done her job well, but the heroine did not understand and asked again. Therefore, the Duke explained to the main character that she had treated Karen well, and the boy even came to him personally. Lillian was very surprised by Von Hart's smile, since he rarely smiles, and she assumed that he was now very happy with such a step from his son. And then the girl told the man that she was glad that he had become close to Karen, and he called it all unusual, because the young lord had not come to him since the death of Duchess Iris. The main character immediately noticed that just the mention of his name brought notes of tenderness to the Duke's voice. However, remembering Karen's words, Lillian thought about it and could not believe that Von Hart could really kill his wife. But suddenly, the girl was interrupted from her thoughts and quickly reached into her purse, telling the Duke that she had something for him. A few seconds later, the main character took out an iris, and saying that it blooms beautifully in the garden, handed it to Hart. And continuing, Lillian told about the floral scent of the iris that filled her room with fragrance, but there was nothing in the Duke's office, and so she decided to give flowers to him too. However, seeing the man's ambiguous reaction, the girl felt like she had said something wrong again, and therefore immediately felt awkward. The Duke himself, having placed the gift in a vase, suggested that it would be better for Karen to already hold the wedding ceremony and not delay. The main character was shocked by this decision, and she asked again, not understanding why Hart wanted to do this so suddenly. But the man continued and said that he had heard about Lillian's meeting with the princess, and it seemed to him that Gloria was interested in her. And since the girl is a princess, she will keep an eye on the heroine, so there will be even more suspicion if Lillian continues to see Karen. So, in order not to attract the attention of the imperial family, it would be better for the main character to take the position of the wife of the Duke's son. Besides, marriage is just a shell of a contract, so as soon as it ends, the guys can get divorced. However, the girl was interested in the young gentleman's opinion about this decision. After all, Lillian believed that there was no point in marriage if Karen was against it. But the heroine also understood that if the Duke loved his son, then he would not even want to think about such a thing. The man himself almost immediately turned towards the girl and confidently replied that the young lord would not mind. Moreover, Von Hart thought that Karen would be, on the contrary, happy if the princess reduced her interest in him, seeing that he was married. Lillian thought about it, because even though the Duke said he was trying to protect her, she knew he just wanted to use her as a cover. But despite this, the heroine saw sense in Hart's words, because if she married the young gentleman, her frequent meetings with him would no longer seem so suspicious. However, the girl still could not accept the fact that she would become Karen's wife, and began to convince herself of this in every possible way. And at that moment, Lillian realized that there would be a lot of noise if everyone found out that she was a legionnaire, but everything would be even worse if she became the wife of the young lord. But the man interrupted the main character's thoughts and, holding the contract closer, said that he would pay enough after the divorce. The girl immediately began to familiarize herself with the document, trying to find the most important thing with her eyes, the amount. And as soon as Lillian saw the payment of 10,000, her eyes immediately lit up, and the idea of marriage no longer seemed unsuccessful. Therefore, the heroine immediately began to remove this thought from her head so as not to succumb to money, but Hart, from such a reaction, assumed that the proposed amount was small. So, having changed the amount of the fee, the man again handed Lillian the contract in the hope of her agreement. And this time, the amount was so large that the girl could not count the number of zeros and froze in shock. But without thinking twice, the main character still agrees, because the amount offered by Von Hart was too tempting for her to refuse. The next day, Lillian couldn't believe that she had finally agreed and was going to the vow ceremony. The girl immediately remembered the Duke's words that, given the circumstances, the ceremony would be held in an unusual way. The heroine will have to make a verbal promise and enter into a contract that binds souls together, and the man will also need her blood. And now, entering the hall, Lillian was a little worried and hoped that this was not a ritual of summoning a demon. Von Hart immediately turned his attention to the girl, noting that she had arrived just in time. Lillian agreed, and saying that Olivia had woken her up, looked down at the floor in surprise. And continuing, the main character became interested in the circle below, which made her very wary. The man did not hide anything and said that this was a circle of ancient magic. Hearing this, the girl was shocked and became even more frightened because it was illegal. In an empire where magical engineering flourishes, ancient magic is considered a dead and obsolete art. A form of magic that has survived to this day has absorbed the legacy of the ancients. It is called black magic. And while Lillian was trying to come to her senses, the Duke explained that his late father was very interested in the dark arts, and now, thanks to the fact that the man has a heroine, he will be able to successfully perform the ritual. The girl continued to stand silently, not understanding what was happening, because the atmosphere was very eerie. At that moment, Olivia came up and asked Von Hart to check the condition of the Grail again to make sure that everything was in order. But suddenly the door began to open, and all the main character's attention shifted to it. It was Karen, and despite the wedding agreement, Lillian was surprised by his arrival. After all, the girl was sure that the young lord would reject the marriage proposal with disgust, and did not understand how the Duke managed to convince him. At that moment, the boy approached the main character and, without further ado, immediately asked if she liked him. However, Lillian would prefer not to answer, because she considered this question inappropriate on Karen's part, but since they were destined to see each other often, she would treat him in a friendly and understanding manner. So, having thought everything over, the heroine, with slight awkwardness, told Karen that she liked him. The young lord was very confused and shocked by this answer, as he expected something completely different. So the boy turned away and asked Lillian how she could answer such a question so easily, since she had only seen him a couple of times. Continuing, Karen asked the heroine if such a marriage would suit her, even if he liked her too. Since Lillian had barely awakened as a legionnaire, she immediately rushed to the aid of the young lord. And Karen is grateful to the main character for saving him from the princess, but still the girl is not at all like Gloria. After these words, Lillian understood how the Duke managed to convince his son. However, she is not just his partner, and Hart uses her sympathy against Karen. The boy interrupted the heroine's thoughts, and noted that when he and Lillian grew up, they would most likely get divorced. And this really bothered him, because he believed that such a marriage was worse than one of convenience. But the main character did not agree with this, because she realized that generous payment awaited her in the future. Karen explained to the girl that she shouldn't be so trusting, because anyone on the street could deceive her. However, Lillian knew the truth, and, feeling awkward, understood that he was the one being deceived here. The young lord, not hearing an answer, reminded her that he had asked the heroine not to trust the Duke, and also warned that he also had something to threaten her with. But Lillian wasn't scared, and said that people who are truly threatening don't say things like that. They hide a knife behind their back and act very friendly. Therefore, the main character will never believe Karen that he is dangerous, since he openly talks about it. After some time, the oath ceremony began and the guys took their places. Lillian agreed to be the mirror of Karen's soul and vowed to look only at him. The young lord swore with his heart and blood to follow only the main heroine. After these words were spoken, 2 precious stones rose into the air from the Grail, illuminated by a bright light. And at that moment, Von Hart gave a short signal to Olivia, causing them to disperse. The Duke walked up to Lillian and silently began to place the necklace around her neck, which surprised her greatly. And then, seeing that Olivia gave the piercing to Karen, the heroine completely stopped understanding what was happening. The man himself, as soon as he finished, explained that now, when necessary, the young lord and Lillian would be able to find each other. The main character immediately became tense, because all this time she thought that she was just doing the Duke a favor, but now she had a feeling that he had outplayed her. After the vow ceremony, the girl was assigned a personal bodyguard, and it was Ethan, who immediately introduced himself and said that it was an honor for him to serve the heroine. The heroine heard about the boy from Karen and was pleasantly surprised that he was the one protecting her, but Ethan himself continued, explaining that he was just a bodyguard, so she could feel free to have any conversations in his presence. At that moment, Olivia came up and told him that Ethan was her son, so if the girl had problems with the princess, she could convey everything to the woman through him. After these words, Lillian realized that from now on the Duke would receive reports on everything she said and did, so now she would have to think before she said anything. Having thought everything over, the heroine immediately hugged Olivia and asked her not to forget about her, as she really wanted to see the maid again next time. The woman was touched by this, and, hugging the girl back a little, she noted that it was impossible to forget her, and they would definitely meet again. Olivia then put Lillian in the carriage, telling her to eat well and to refrain from running until her leg healed. The main character agreed with everything, however, on the way home, the girl remembered something important, and frowning, Lillian realized that she had made a mistake in not recognizing the maid earlier. Olivia is not a legionnaire, but an ordinary person. She is a capable officer of Von Hart, who always helps him in everything. But in the past, the girl was a notorious traitor who betrayed the Duke. Olivia herself came to the Duke's office, where he asked her opinion about Lillian, whom she had been observing for a long time. The maid became a little tense at this question, but still decided to tell everything honestly. That's why the girl immediately cringed with emotion and squealed that the main character was very cute. Continuing, Olivia told how the girl rushed to hug her, and also added that she looked like a fluffy ball of cotton candy. But the Duke got angry and banged on the table, asking the maid not to fall for such a thing, as it was not like Lillian. Then the man reminded that the heroine knew his nickname, Calvados, and immediately asked Olivia if she had anything that could be added to the dossier. To which the servant, already a little nervously, replied that she had not noticed anything suspicious and that Lillian was just a child who enjoyed life, so she did not think that the girl had any selfish motives. Hart was very surprised because he had never heard such emotional feedback from Olivia about anyone. After these words, the girl thought that the Duke considered this a problem and decided to clarify. The maid also pointed to the flowers that Lady Lances had brought, and then asked the man if he liked them. However, instead of answering, the Duke asked him to be more careful with his words, and the girl immediately noticed that he had been overly tense lately, but she did not understand the reason. Continuing, Von Hart reminded her that Lillian was no longer Lady Lances, and asked the maid to remember to call his daughter-in-law by her proper name. And turning away, the man asked if anything was known about Brandon, since he had not been in touch at all. Olivia replied in the negative, and explained that the lack of news meant that the little lady wanted to see the Duke. There are currently only 2 officers that Von Hart trusts to handle the business. Olivia is in charge of everything in the light of day, while Brandon does his job under the cover of shadows. And these 2 assistants are legal husband and wife. So now the girl decided to ask Brandon to take a couple of days off when she returned, since she hadn't seen him for a very long time. But the Duke analyzed everything and understood that no suspicious information had come from the young man either, and he trusted him. And while Olivia continued to hint at a vacation for her husband, Hart ignored it and said that they needed to move on to the next issue. At this time, the main character had already arrived at the Lanches estate. At the entrance, Lillian was greeted by all the servants and immediately bowed to her. However, the girl froze in shock and, looking at the servants, did not understand who all these people were. The heroine also did not recognize her house at all, and while she was trying to comprehend what was happening, a man apologized to her for not introducing himself right away. And continuing, the man said that he was the new butler of the Lanches estate, Harold. The man then bowed and said that the estate had been renovated, so he asked the girl to inspect everything in her free time. As soon as Lillian realized that this was the servant hired by the Duke, she immediately became happy and asked about her brother's whereabouts. Harold immediately replied that Edmund was in his room, but asked the heroine to rest from the journey, since she was still recovering. The girl ignored this and decided to check whether her uncle and aunt were at home, to which the butler responded in the affirmative. Without further ado, Lillian told the man to call them. After some time, Henry burst into the room rejoicing at the return of the main character. After all, the man thought he would go crazy because of Lillian's long absence, and besides, he didn't like the new servants, whom he didn't want to let in at all, if not for the Duke's order. And although Henry understood that he was only a guardian, he still told the girl his thoughts about Von Hart exceeding his authority, and the heroine herself, putting down the cup, said that it was her request. Continuing, Lillian thanked her uncle for agreeing because the estate was now in perfect order and she liked it. However, the main character also explained to her relatives that she asked the butler to call them because she had something to say. Without further ado, Lillian ordered her aunt and uncle to leave the house immediately. These words shocked Henry and Vanessa very much, and they could not believe what was said. The woman got angry and immediately expressed her dissatisfaction with the fact that her niece turned out to be more stupid than she thought. Vanessa also assumed that the Duke's patronage had completely turned the heroine's head, so she decided to remind her that the girl was not yet a duchess. And if Lillian loses her inheritance, the woman will only be happy, because it will go to Edmund. After hearing this, the main character immediately realized that Vanessa was no longer going to pretend to be a good aunt, and turning her attention to Henry, the girl noticed that he was not even going to object to the woman. Therefore, my aunt and uncle never had and never will have any agreement with the rest. And after thinking it over, Lillian asked Vanessa if she was really worried that her niece would not receive the inheritance, to which her face immediately changed and politely agreed. But the heroine, although she said that she was very pleased that her aunt was worried about her, still refused this inappropriate help, which brings more harm than good. Then Lillian announced that Edmund would be entering the academy, and also said that they were friends, but the relatives, of course, did not know about this. Vanessa immediately began to be indignant again, until Henry decided to ask how the heroine would live alone in the estate. But Lillian asked not to worry about this, since she was getting married and her husband was Karen von Hart, a young duke. The relatives were shocked by this news, and they immediately fell silent because for them it was all very unexpected. The girl also said that she took Karen from another contender, and the Duke himself would teach her how to manage the family's affairs. And when she finished, Lillian rang the bell, hoping that her aunt and uncle understood everything. A few seconds later, the servants entered the room, and the main character told them that Vanessa and Henry wanted to return home as soon as possible, and asked the young men to help them. The young men immediately accepted the order and came closer, causing the relatives to start to panic a little. And as soon as the servants began to perform, Vanessa began to break free and scream that Lillian would not be able to live without them. However, the main character only smiled and replied that she would not only be able to live alone, but would also enjoy life, and her aunt would see everything herself. After meeting with her relatives, Lillian immediately ran to Edmund, who was in the yard at that time. The boy was surprised by his sister's appearance, but chose not to say anything. The heroine, coming closer, inquired about Edmund's condition and life in her absence. However, the young duke avoided details and only said that he was told to pass the exam. Lillian was a little upset that her brother decided to get straight to the point, but she still did not change the subject and confirmed that what was said needed to be handed in. Hearing this, Edmund said with concern that he had a very busy schedule, and the heroine explained to the boy that she was simply afraid that his relatives might start bothering him, and Lillian herself was surprised that the Duke helped sort this out quickly enough. The young Duke decided to end the conversation about admission and asked his sister if her legs were feeling better, to which she confidently replied that she was already running. Edmund immediately smiled and looked warmly at his sister, saying that he was very glad to hear about the improvement in her condition. After these words, Lillian was a little confused, as she did not expect that the boy had been worried about her all this time. The young Duke himself at that moment turned his attention to Ethan standing nearby and asked who it was. The heroine immediately introduced the boys to each other and told her brother that the Duke had assigned a bodyguard to her. And while the guys were getting acquainted, Lillian asked Edmund if he would like her to keep him company tomorrow. The young Duke, thinking that he should prepare better for the test, still agreed to his sister's proposal. The main character was very happy about this because this was their first joint appearance, which she would now look forward to with impatience. The next day, the boys arrived at the academy on time and stood near the entrance. Lillian told her brother not to worry, and if he didn't know the answer, to skip the question and come back to it later. The heroine also assumed that the boy might be hungry and therefore immediately put a candy in his hand. However, Edmund himself was almost completely calm and noted that Lillian was clearly more worried than he was. And even though the girl knew that her brother would definitely cope, she still couldn't help but worry. At that moment, the young Duke turned around and was already heading in the right direction, but Lillian stopped him, since she had forgotten to tell the news because of the exam. And after making sure that her brother was listening to her, the heroine announced that she was getting married. At this news, Edmund dropped the treat from his hands, and the boy himself turned around in shock and asked again. Lillian, noticing that the candy had fallen, immediately reached out to pick it up to give it back to Edmund, and ignored his question. Therefore, when the heroine handed him the sweet, the young duke again asked what kind of marriage they were talking about. But Lillian said that she would tell everything after the exam so that her brother would definitely not be late. However, Edmund could not get the thought of the heroine's wedding out of his head, so he left very worried, and the girl immediately wished him good luck. Lillian then approached Ethan with a proposal to take a walk around the city, since the exam would last quite a long time, and there was no point in standing still. But in reality, the girl didn't want to miss the chance to get to know the future swordmaster better. The main character is also very interested in the Munez family. After all, in my first life there were rumors circulating in society. In the past, the girls discussed the fall of the Munez family and how they betrayed Duke von Hart. But one of the ladies became a little wary and asked her friend to be careful with her words, because if the Duke found out that they were talking about this, they would be punished. However, the second girl believed that the man did not care about these traitors and did not want unnecessary conversations, so nothing would happen to them for discussing them. Although, of course, betrayal in close circles cannot help but upset. Therefore, the title of the great traitor was assigned to Olivia after she betrayed Duke von Hart. But the strange thing was that Ethan Munez, the son of a traitor, received no punishment despite constant criticism. The boy eventually became a member of the von Hart Duchy's Dark Moon Knights. And then the main character decided that it didn't concern her, so she didn't investigate anything. But Lillian still found it quite suspicious and thought that something was definitely wrong. Having thought everything over, the girl told her bodyguard that they would now go to the center. However, Ethan didn't like it a little, as he considered the main character to be an ordinary girl and didn't understand why she was telling him what to do. Earlier, the Duke asked the knight to follow Lillian and report absolutely everything to him. But the man also warned the boy to try not to answer difficult questions. However, if he still has to talk, Ethan must answer that everything is fine or refuse. The young knight did not expect this, so after listening to the instructions, he accepted everything without further ado. And now, as Lillian looked around the city, she wondered if Ethan thought he wouldn't have to answer questions. However, the heroine immediately moved closer to the boy and asked him if he thought people were looking at them. But the young knight, as ordered, replied that everything was in order, and this surprised the girl very much. After all, turning her gaze back to the people, Lillian was convinced that she had not imagined it. Absolutely all the people in the center were spying on the main character from behind their newspapers. So, noticing a little boy walking past with newspapers, Lillian asked for one for herself. And as soon as the main character started reading the very first article, she was shocked. After all, on the first page was written Lillian's story, and that Duke von Hart had already announced the wedding and held the wedding ceremony. And looking at the photo, the heroine assumed that it was taken secretly right in front of the estate. And now, since Lillian's photo is in the newspaper, most people in the capital already know her. That's why the girl got very angry and decided to look for those who did it. However, at this time, an unknown man standing around the corner took another photo, and looking at the frame, the photographer thought about a new article, since now all the newspapers are writing about a girl who became a princess overnight. The main character was still tense from the understanding that people were getting big money for her photos. The paparazzi himself noticed that the photo was blurry because the camera shook and was a little upset. And as soon as the man decided to reshoot for better quality, Ethan came up and kicked the camera out of his hands. The photographer immediately began to get angry and indignant, looking at the boy in shock, while Ethan himself very displeasedly and silently watched the further actions of the paparazzi. The man did not remain silent and called the young knight a Kelton, not understanding how such a person could be near Lillian. But the heroine didn't like it, and she called this behavior disgusting, because in addition to the fact that the paparazzi was taking photos without permission, he also started being rude. After all, Kelton is a derogatory nickname for those who are of humble origin and those who come from the people, so it is a very offensive word that cannot be said to someone's face. The man was immediately very confused because he had never been caught before, and in a panic, he called himself just a passerby. However, Lillian didn't believe me and said that she knew how to use a camera, so she checked all the photos. Moreover, the main character's knight is so good that he is immediately noticed by the paparazzi, so all he can do is confess to what he did. But the young man continued to deny the accusations and pretend that he did not understand what was being discussed. Hearing this, Lillian threatened to break the camera and asked the photographer again if he had taken the photo. The man immediately began to say that he was sorry and begged her to give the camera back because it was very expensive, but at that moment, the heroine remembered him from her past life. This is Jack, the infamous paparazzo, and now he seems like a rookie, but in just a couple of years he will become the most insidious photographer. The young man will sell photos with false information, and sometimes this will even lead to death. And as soon as the girl remembered everything, she immediately began to scold the man, saying everything to his face. With every word the paparazzi said, it became worse, because he understood that everything said about him was the truth, which he could not accept. In the end, the man couldn't take it anymore and asked him to stop, but the heroine was still unhappy that the photographer didn't like it when others scolded him, but he himself threw insults. Lillian also understood that if she took the camera, it didn't mean that anything would change, because the young man would simply buy a new one and go back to his old ways. However, the main character will not leave Ethan's insult so easily, so she tells the man that if he wants to return the camera, he must go after her. Approaching the young knight, the girl explained to the photographer that one should not insult people based on their appearance. And starting to count to 3, Lillian waited for her words to be repeated, but the man became very worried and could not really say anything. That's why the main character yelled at the young man and told him he was speaking too quietly and asked him to say it all over again. But the photographer was again very confused, so the girl, with even greater aggression, ordered him to repeat her words, and the man, frightened, immediately did what he was told. Having heard what she wanted, Lillian explained that Ethan himself would decide whether to forgive the young man or not, and if the young knight wanted, she would beat the man. However, the boy answered without hesitation that everything was fine. The main character was upset by this attitude towards the situation, and she asked Ethan again if everything was really okay, since the paparazzi had literally just insulted him. But the young knight called it all a trifle and said nothing more. Lillian immediately frowned, as such a calm reaction suggested that the boy was told this often, but she couldn't believe that he was really that unremarkable. And despite Ethan's words, the main character still did not tolerate it, because she believed that the photographer could not just leave. So a second later, the girl hit the young man between the legs, causing him to immediately scream. But the young knight did not expect this from Lillian, and simply watched from the side in shock as they stood up for him. The main character finally called the man a vile person and decided to end it there. At that moment, the young man was trying to come to his senses and was worried about the fact that he wasn't even married yet. After some time, Lillian was already very proud of herself because she caught the paparazzi and managed to buy Edmund a gift. The girl then told Ethan that she would have been in trouble if the day had not been so eventful, but the knight again remained silent. However, the main character immediately turned to the boy and handed him a small box. And while Ethan was looking at the gift, Lillian said that she noticed how interested the boy was in desserts, so she thought about his desire to eat something sweet and decided to buy some. The young knight was very surprised, because in the store it seemed to him that the heroine was busy choosing a gift for her brother and did not pay attention to him at all. And now Ethan just stood there, silently looking at the box, which made Lillian a little confused. So the girl assumed that the knight did not like the gift and asked about it. However, Ethan, without taking his eyes off the box, said that he liked the gift. The main character immediately became happy and noticed that the young duke also carried candy, so the boy had similar tastes. And seeing Ethan's reaction to these words, Lillian realized that he didn't really like all of this. Then the heroine looked at the crowd of children nearby and assumed that the exam was already over. That's why the girl immediately found Edmund with her eyes and started calling him, asking if he had written the test well. Also, when the boy approached, Lillian asked about the difficulty of the questions and began to wait for an answer. But Edmund himself was clearly tense and, ignoring his sister's interest in the exam, he asked what kind of marriage they were talking about. The heroine didn't like the fact that her brother again got straight to the point, but she suggested that they first get into the carriage. And while in transport, Lillian began to tell everything about the wedding. The girl also did not hide the fact that her husband was Karen von Hart, which immediately shocked Edmund. Then the young duke asked if she and Karen were really together, but the heroine answered negatively and explained that she was just visiting the estate. These words made Edmund even more worried, and he began to ask questions about feelings and their love, but Lillian said that Karen had not confessed anything to her. And while the boy continued his interrogation, the heroine turned away from him a little because she realized that he thought that she was passionately in love with the young lord, and she felt awkward. Edmund, however, expressed his suspicion that Lillian had been deceived, so he began to read the article of the law to help his sister, but she stopped him, explaining that she herself wanted it. However, from her brother's eyes and reaction, the main character saw that he did not believe her at all. Therefore, the girl decided to take extreme measures, since there was no other choice. And blushing? Lillian told how she fell in love with Karen at first sight. Hearing this, the boys looked at the main character in shock and could not believe what was said. But Lillian herself did not understand why Ethan was also surprised and worried that she had made a mistake. However, the main character continued and said that Karen is an incredible person. After all, the young Duke has beautiful black hair, golden eyes that look like the sun, and colors in his clothes that touch both day and night. Lillian also added admiringly that Karen had sharp features, as if he were a lone wolf, but despite all the words, the girl herself at that moment could not find a place for herself from awkwardness. Edmund lowered his head and noted that if the main character really liked the young Duke, then he believed that nothing could be done about it. After these words, Lillian assumed that her lone wolf strategy was working and was very happy. However, the boy decided to warn his sister that men cannot understand whether they love if they have only seen a woman a couple of times. The main character immediately asked for forgiveness in anticipation of the continuation, because she did not believe that such a small child could know anything about love. And Edmund explained that he had heard that love and marriage were different things, so he asked the girl to let him know if it suddenly turned out that the young Duke had problems with his character. The boy then turned to Ethan to ask him what kind of person Karen really was, as he assumed he knew him well due to his closeness to the ducal family. The knight immediately came up with a positive, negative, and neutral description of Karen in his head, and he decided to be brief and say that he was nothing special. However, Edmund did not like this answer, because he believed that if a person does not stand out in any way, it does not mean that he is good. Lillian, sensing the tense situation, realized that it was imperative to change the subject and immediately called her brother. And continuing, the heroine told the boy that while he was taking the exam, she bought him gifts. Edmund asked again for clarification, and Lillian confirmed and said that she had already told the maids to wrap them up and they could go home and unpack each one. The boy agreed without further ado, and the heroine, hearing a positive answer, was very happy. After all, everything seemed to work out, and Lillian's assumption that children are children was confirmed. After some time, the guys finally arrived at the Lanches estate. Edmund was already standing in his room, looking at the gifted teddy bear, and could not believe that his sister had given it to him without any jokes. So the boy immediately asked what it was, and the heroine mentally answered that it was something she bought at the toy store. Then Lillian came closer and explained that she chose this bear because she thought that her brother would be lonely at first, since he would not know anyone in the dorm, but Edmund himself looked at the boxes and hoped that they contained more than just toys. The main character also added that perhaps the boy would feel absolutely normal during the day, but in the evening, she was sure that he would definitely be lonely. And at such moments, Edmund must remember that Lillian loves him and he is not alone. After that, the heroine said that if you press on the toy's chest, it will say that very phrase. But the boy had already noticed this earlier, so he didn't try. And Lillian decided to end it there, and, asking him to hold the teddy bear tighter while he slept, she handed it to his brother. Edmund took the toy in his hands and thought about the main character's words about love for him. And the boy understood that these words from his sister meant a lot to him, so he would not refuse the teddy bear. At this time, the sensation about the new secret hobby of the nobles was actively spreading in the newspapers, and all those who held secret meetings to study black magic were arrested. Lillian, sitting at the table, assumed that absolutely every nobleman was questioned about this case, and Edmund confirmed this, since even relatives of their family were involved in this. The main character immediately said that the relatives most likely tried to open a business with the help of black magic, because otherwise there was no reason for their detention. When this scandal first started in Lillian's past life, she was very surprised why Henry was so happy. And it turned out that the whole thing was that the business was run by the Valles family, and while Vanessa was busy dealing with the case, Henry personally took control of the Lanches family. But now the main character is the only one who enjoys what is happening. Edmund immediately noticed his sister's grin, so assuming that it was she who had arranged everything, he asked about it. However, Lillian responded in the negative and said that she did not even have time to read the newspaper and did not know what was going on there. But in fact, the main character gave a little food for thought. And on the day of the exam, the girl told the paparazzi about the opera singer Carmela. Lillian told the young man that the girl had someone with whom she regularly met alone, but the young man began to actively deny it. However, the photographer was still interested and decided to ask Ethan about all this, while the girl herself watched from the side, happy that her plan was working. Carmela is a famous opera singer who is a commoner. Soon the girl was to be involved in a scandal with the nobility. And as expected, the photographer began to follow Carmela. Therefore, in the end, most likely, the young man discovered that the singer's lover was studying black magic. However, initially, a journalist with a heightened sense of justice took on this case, but everything ended badly. Because even high-ranking nobles were involved in this, and it all led to the journalist being sued, thus creating a lot of problems. But this time, the paparazzo that Lillian caught will be the one who gets sued. And at the moment, this is the best way for the main character to take revenge. Edmund sat silently, looking at his sister and trying to understand what she was thinking. After all, the boy was shocked by the sudden news of marriage, but since he is Lillian's half-brother, he can't just stop her. However, if the main character is ever hurt, Edmund will personally stand by her side to protect her. But to do this, the boy must gain strength to resist the ducal family. So even if all this will not last forever, and it will last as long as Edmund is useful, then he really hopes that Lillian will be useful. After some time, it became known that Edmund easily passed the exam and entered the academy. Therefore, the boy was already moving to a dormitory, and the heroine asked him not to focus only on his studies. Continuing, Lillian told her brother to try to find friends who shared the same interests as him, because this was a great opportunity to expand the boundaries of his world. But the boy interrupted the heroine, saying that he had something to tell her. And as soon as Lillian finished speaking, Edmund asked her if she had ever been to the scene of the crime. The main character immediately thought of the road accident in which her father and stepmother died, and her brother injured his leg, but this was the first time he mentioned what happened since the funeral. So Lillian was surprised and asked if anything unusual had happened that day. However, the boy turned around and asked to forget, as he was simply curious and went in the right direction. And the heroine was at first outraged that Edmund decided to end the dialogue on such a note, but then she realized that it was better not to disturb bad memories. So Lillian shouted after her brother that she would write him letters and asked him not to forget to write back if anything happened. Edmund, without turning around, agreed and said that he understood everything. The boy also listened to Lillian and took the gifted teddy bear with him, putting it in his briefcase. 2 weeks later, the main character arrived back at the Von Hart estate. The girl immediately looked into the room and, calling the Duke her father, said that she was home. The man was shocked by such a greeting, so he just looked at her in surprise and remained silent. And the servants who were next to the Duke at that moment looked at each other questioningly, trying to understand what was happening. Lillian headed towards the man and simultaneously asked about all the news that had happened while she was gone. But not hearing anything in response, the heroine assumed that her behavior now was unceremonious and that Von Hart should still be called Duke. However, the man said that everything was fine because Lillian had officially married his son, which meant that she could now call him father. The servants were very surprised that the Duke reacted so calmly to all this, and in their thoughts they assumed that he was in a good mood. At this time, Hart told the girl that she could go to her room, as he understood that she needed to rest after the journey, to which she immediately thanked him and ran in the right direction. But suddenly the Duke asked Lillian to stop, and she immediately froze in place, not understanding what was going on. The man came closer and took the heroine in his arms, saying that it would obviously be difficult for her to find her way, so he would carry her. Lillian immediately began to be indignant and say that she knew where to go, but Hart explained to her that she now lived in a different place. The main character was confused by these words and asked again. However, the man only smiled slightly and carried the girl to her new bedroom. In the room itself, Olivia was already waiting for Lillian and began giving her a tour, saying that they had recently renovated it especially for her. Then the maid led the heroine a little further and showed her the living room. The girl also said that from the balcony, Lillian can enjoy views of the garden while sipping tea. But at the moment with the wardrobe, the girl stopped the tour with displeasure and said that she would prefer to stay somewhere else. The Duke immediately assumed that this room was too small for the main character, so the man asked Olivia to call the contractors to knock down the walls today and turn the entire floor into a room. The maid reminded him that on this floor there was a room where the former Duke kept paintings, and she became thoughtful. However, almost immediately, Olivia said that she believed this would not be a problem. But upon hearing this, Lillian interrupted and explained that she meant that the room was too luxurious for someone like her. The Duke immediately frowned and asked the girl why she thought so. The main character herself thought about it because she really can hardly restrain her desire for luxury. Because if Lillian gets used to places like this, she might repeat the life of greed she led in the past. So the girl said she would prefer something smaller, with not so much light, and something like an attic, where everything around is covered in a layer of dust and there are bugs. Olivia and the Duke were frozen in shock by such wishes and could not immediately find the words. However, the main character continued and explained, shouting that she was used to such non-luxurious places. But almost immediately, Lillian noticed that the atmosphere around her had become more tense and realized that she had gone too far. At this point, the Duke broke the silence and explained to the girl that she was living here with Karen and, given the public attention, they had to share one room. The man also added that as the daughter-in-law of the Dukedom of Hart, if Lillian stayed in a place like an attic, she would be looked down upon. So the Duke told the main character to just use this room. Lillian realized that if the man insisted so much, then she had no choice, and agreed. And after a tour of the room, the heroine still decided to drink tea on the balcony. Olivia, setting the table, addressed the girl a little hesitantly. Continuing, the girl became confused, but added that she needed to tell something. And bowing, the maid confessed that she was the Duke's assistant, and she sincerely apologized for hiding her identity and gaining the heroine's trust. However, in her thoughts, Lillian also asked Olivia for forgiveness because she had long known about her true identity. And the main character also knows that the girl will soon betray the Duke. And even though the girl didn't see anything suspicious in Olivia, she was still interested in how carefully she was planning her betrayal. After all, even if Lillian tried to get information from Ethan, he wouldn't tell her anything special, so she decided to try to convince Olivia of this. The girl continued and suggested that the heroine feels betrayed and disappointed because she did not reveal her identity from the very beginning. However, the heroine interrupted and said that everything was fine and for her she would remain the same Olivia. Lillian also added that she likes the girl the way she is, which made her even more touched. And then Olivia asked the main character to accept a gift from her as an apology. It was a ticket to the opera, which surprised the girl very much. Lillian accepted the gift, and after some time, the carriage with her arrived at the opera house. The Duke got out of the transport in front of the main character. And everyone around, noticing Von Hart, began to discuss his appearance, trying to understand who he was accompanying. Lillian herself at that moment looked at the theater with admiration in anticipation of the opera. Moreover, the fact that the main character was going there with her father made her even happier. However, on the day Olivia gave the tickets, the girl immediately realized that it was not just like that. And going to the theater is part of a carefully planned war for public opinion. After all, after suddenly marrying Karen, Lillian became a duchess overnight, which would result in many questioning glances falling on her. And Duke Hart intends to lay the foundation for the girl as a young duchess, and he intends to show what a good relationship they are on. And before entering the building, Lillian turned towards Olivia, not very trustingly. Because the main character realized that the girl was not just a capable assistant to the Duke and was clearly hiding something. The production itself was about a difficult love story. In it, the main character is a monster, and his beloved is an ordinary person. And the most important drama of this opera was in the conflict between the heroes. That's why everyone watched the production with interest and without distraction. At this moment, the hero of the opera confessed to his beloved that in fact he looks terrible and feels hungry when he sees her like this. However, Lillian didn't really like this moment because the directors portrayed the Legionnaires as monsters. The Duke noticed that the actress was not playing very well and said that perhaps she had little experience, to which the girl asked again in surprise. And Olivia joined the discussion, suggesting that the girl had hardly had time to get into character. After all, initially the lead actress was supposed to be Carmela, but she was forced to leave the production due to rumors of infidelity and black magic. Continuing, Olivia also talked about how the play is based on the Duke's love, and that is why many people might not like it. Hearing this, Lillian immediately turned her full attention to Von Hart, waiting for details, as this was a chance to get to know the Duke and Duchess better. However, the man said that this was nothing more than imagination and exaggerated rumors that were picked up somewhere. But these words did not remove the heroine's interest, and continuing to look at Hart, she assumed that there were coincidences after all. And then Lillian began to ask the Duke to tell her something, since she wanted to hear more about her father's love story. The man immediately turned towards the main character and began to take off his glasses. The girl immediately noticed Hart's eyes and was surprised by their appearance. The Duke's eyes were an unusual color, which frightened and fascinated at the same time. And the man explained that even when he doesn't use his abilities, his eyes look the same and normal, which makes not only ordinary people, but even other legionnaires avoid him. But the Duke's wife was the only one who accepted him as he was. After these words, Lillian noted that the Duchess was an incredibly kind person. Von Hart agreed with the girl and said that there was no other wife in the world like the Duchess. The heroine immediately noticed the loving expression on the man's face and felt awkward asking about his love story. However, Lillian's attention was distracted by extraneous sounds behind her, and turning around she saw Olivia's suspicious behavior. After all, the girl very unexpectedly and in a hurry began to leave, without warning about anything. The main character immediately understood that she needed to keep an eye on her assistant and had already started to get up, but the Duke stopped her and asked what had happened. And continuing, the man suggested that the girl did not like the acting at all, to which she immediately began to deny it. Then Hart thought that Lillian, like everyone else, was also afraid of his eyes. But the main character said very emotionally that this is not true at all. After all, in fact, the girl saw the Duke's eyes not for the first time, and thinking about this, Lillian began to come up with a reason to move away. Finally, the girl, a little worried, said that she needed to go to the toilet. And without waiting for an answer, the main character very quickly headed towards the exit. However, the Duke still found it suspicious and thought about it, because the man didn't understand at all what the girl was trying to do. In the Munez family's report, David had previously apologized for being late and explained that no matter how much he researched Lillian, he couldn't find anything. Olivia confirmed her husband's words and said that she had thought about it a lot and believed that the young lady was harmless. Ethan also did not remain silent and said that the main character is ordinary. But after a couple of seconds, the boy clarified that Lillian still seemed strange to him. And now, remembering everything, the Duke began to become more and more convinced that the heroine really was a strange child. Lillian herself was running down the corridor at this time, trying to catch up with Olivia. Having stopped, the girl began to look around because she understood that the assistant could not have gone far and must be somewhere nearby. And almost immediately after these thoughts, the heroine saw Olivia standing next to the mirror. Lillian began to come closer, but the girl, without turning around, stopped her and asked why she left. The main character immediately felt very strange and did not understand the reason. But as Olivia continued to talk about how the production was not over yet, the girl began to guess what was going on. So Lillian decided not to delay, and confidently told her assistant that she was not Olivia, and then the main character asked the girl who she was. The assistant immediately apologized and asked again in order to find out who she was, if not Olivia. Lillian frowned at these words, saying that she had the same question for the girl because she was sure that this was a different person, because the real Olivia is not a Legionnaire, but an ordinary person. The girl immediately turned around and asked the main character how she understood this. Lillian didn't go into details and replied that she found out about it by accident. The Legionnaire became a little worried, saying that Ethan was right about the girl being strange. And after these words, a more familiar face appeared before the heroine. It was Brandon, Duke von Hart's second mate. Lillian was very shocked by the young man's appearance, to which he suggested that it would be more correct not to say anything. However, the main character's face immediately changed and she asked about the whereabouts of the real Olivia, and the young man replied that most likely the girl was dealing with the accumulated work on the estate. But Lillian didn't believe it and said with disappointment that she was sure that Brandon wouldn't turn out to be a liar. The young man was confused and explained that he had only borrowed his wife's appearance with her permission, so calling him a liar for this was quite cruel. The heroine was very surprised and could not believe that Brandon was Olivia's husband and Ethan's father. The young man himself called himself a true genius of transformation and explained that he is not limited to one gender. And after a couple of seconds, Brandon transformed into Edward, whom they had seen earlier in the theater. Then the young man changed his gender and became the heroine of the opera, to which the girl was even more delighted with what was happening. However, as soon as Brandon changed his appearance to an older man in a robe, the smile disappeared from Lillian's face. After all, for the main character, this appearance was unfamiliar and a little frightening. So the girl assumed that the old man was Brandon's grandfather, but he immediately denied it and said that he had just caught a glimpse of that face somewhere. But in reality, the young man understood that Lillian had no idea about the doctor's identity. However, the young man was distracted from his thoughts by a black liquid flowing from his hand, the sight of which made him panic. The girl was attracted by the sound, and she also noticed the assistant's hand, not understanding what it was. That's why the heroine became worried and immediately told Brandon that his hand was melting. Hearing this, the young man became upset because he did not expect to be caught at the very end, and explained that he can hold on when his mind is full of strength, but over time even his face begins to melt and ooze. Lillian immediately frowned and turned around, saying that she would go call her father, but Brandon stopped her, since if the Duke found out, he would not like it at all. The girl listened, but asked the young man why Hart should kill him for this, since he was not so heartless. The young man agreed with the heroine's opinion about the Duke, but replied that he still shouldn't know about it. And after these words, Brandon decided to show Lillian something, so he began to roll up his sleeve. The young man had a mark on his hand, proving that he had been influenced by black magic and that it was limited. So if Duke Von Hart finds out, Brandon will be killed. The heroine asked how the young man learned about the restrictions, and he said that the doctor who cast black magic on him told him everything himself. Then, when the young man woke up, there was only darkness around. That day, Brandon, as usual, carried out the captain's orders. And when the young man realized that someone in a deep black hood was approaching him, it was already too late, and he lost consciousness. After some time, the assistant woke up from the familiar smell of medicine and the persistent smell of old blood. There was also a man there, the same doctor who was desperately tracking the Duke. The man referred to Brandon as an escaped experimental subject and asked about his new name. Continuing, the doctor told the young man that he had poisoned him, but the test results were positive, so he would soon feel the effects. And if the young man wants to get the antidote, then he must bring the man data on ancient magic that Duke Hart researched. Brandon had only a week, and if he didn't manage to get the data, he would die. However, when the young man came to his senses again, the doctor had already disappeared. After listening to everything, Lillian asked the young man why the man needed all this. But the young man himself knew nothing about this, so the heroine decided to ask if Olivia knew about what happened. To which the young man responded negatively and explained that there had not yet been an opportunity. And after these words, the main character immediately began to think. Lillian was confident that Olivia would find out eventually, even if not right away. After all, the girl is perceptive enough to notice sooner or later that something strange is happening, and it's only a matter of time. The heroine also now realized that the reason Olivia betrayed the Duke was to save her husband, and the girl is ready to help her husband even at the cost of her life. The assistant herself has a unique ability that is invaluable for collecting information. In addition, Olivia is a gifted person who is worthy of Duke Hart's trust and values her family very much. And this is precisely why the main character likes the girl, and that is why she does not want to allow her death. So, after examining the liquid, Lillian suggested that black magic was being used as a constraint, and they needed to get the antidote within a certain amount of time. And continuing, the girl said that if this was the only problem, then she had a solution. However, Brandon immediately warned that it was useless to use the abilities of the Legionnaire Lillian, and if she made a mistake, she would go down the path of black magic. But the main character ignored this and, coming closer, asked the young man if he would have some money. And as soon as the young man agreed, the girl noted that they were lucky. So Lillian asked Brandon to give her the money. Already at the estate, the Duke asked his assistant about the heroine's departure with Brandon. Olivia confirmed this and said that the young man was now disguised as an ordinary servant. Brandon also said that upon returning to the mansion yesterday, Lillian was delighted with the production, and now the main character is going to secretly buy a gift for the Duke. The man immediately asked again, and Olivia assumed that the girl wanted to give him a gift in return. However, the girl became worried because Lillian did not take any escort with her, but Hart immediately reassured her, reminding her that the heroine was now with Brandon. The Duke himself, having finished the dialogue, smiled warmly and began to think about what the girl would give him this time. At this time, Lillian and Brandon arrived at the right place, and the young man, looking around, could not believe that they had come to such an area. Therefore, the young man immediately wondered whether there really would be someone here who could eliminate the doctor's poison, because even he knew nothing about this person. And thinking about it, Brandon realized that he had believed Lillian in vain and decided to just play along now in order to quickly get back home. So the young man moved closer to the girl and asked where exactly they were going. The heroine was already standing, looking at the building, and said that this was Erica's house. Lillian then added that this was the only place where there was a benefactor who could cure Brandon of the poison. And after these words, the girl thought and realized that if someone asked her to describe Eric, she would say that he was the one who made himself in his past life. The young man was hailed as a genius in the field of herbalism and gained recognition in scientific circles after a series of his famous works, thanks to which he quickly became rich and famous. However, 6 years later, those who suspected something was wrong with the young man's actions began a secret investigation against him. It turned out that the genius who was once hailed as the Pearl of the Empire was a fraud who stole all the work from his stepdaughter. And despite the Empire's belated attempts to save Erica, she, long subjected to harsh treatment by her stepfather, died. In her past life, the girl never saw the light and was nicknamed the Unlucky Genius. And Lillian believed that if the doctor who poisoned Brandon was a genius, then someone equally brilliant could outsmart him. But suddenly the girl was distracted from her thoughts by a scream outside the door. In the house, a man was scolding a girl very harshly because she had not done what he asked. And Brandon got a little worried, so he suggested that the heroine come another time. But Lillian no longer listened to the young man and kicked the door down. The young man immediately felt awkward, and the people in the house looked in shock towards the entrance, not understanding what was happening. Erica's stepfather was even more angered by the sudden arrival of strangers, and he shouted at the heroine and asked who she was. Lillian replied with a smile that she was a customer and had come for herbs. But the man started saying that she had been misinformed and that no herbs were sold there, but the girl continued to insist on her own and said that she had definitely not made a mistake with the address. And approaching Erica, the main character said that she had come to pick her up. Then, holding out her hand to the girl, Lillian suggested that they leave here. And already heading in the right direction, the girl asked Brandon to take care of the rest and left. After some time, the young man came back quite tired, as he did not expect that he would have to restrain the man and thought that the heroines only needed money from him. Lillian said that people should be used wisely and in time, and the first thing that needs to be done is to thank your savior. Then the heroine turned to the girl, assuming that she was in shock, and introduced herself. Erica was immediately surprised that Lillian only told her her first name, because it was immediately clear from the girl that she was of noble blood, and usually such people also say their last name. But still, the girl decided not to focus on this now and asked the heroine why she was looking for her. And Lillian explained that she had heard that Erica could create a great cure out of nothing, so she came to her. However, after these words, Brandon was shocked, because even he, the one who operates in the criminal world, knows nothing about this. And the young man did not understand how a little girl who spent her whole life behind closed doors had such information. The heroine continued and said that she wanted to ask Erica for a favor, which she would have only 3 days to complete. But the girl refused, to which Lillian asked to hear her out, because if she accepted the order, the heroine would help her get back on her feet. Because the girl is sure that Erica has thought more than once that she doesn't want to live such a life. The girl herself lives in the slums without money and pretends that she doesn't understand anything at all and doesn't leave her mother's side, while Erica's stepfather takes credit for all of her inventions and articles. Therefore, the main character understood that the girl was tired of all this and wanted to escape, so Lillian showed Erica a bottle of black liquid, asking if she knew what it was, to which the girl immediately said that it was slime. And the heroine was not surprised by the quick answer, because she was sure that Erica would instantly recognize the contents of the flask. Because the slums have a low level of security, and it is easier to encounter monsters there than in other places. Nowadays, monsters are considered bad creatures that legionnaires fight. But once serious research into these creatures begins, everything will change dramatically thanks to Erica and her dissertation. So Lillian continued, and hinting at Brandon, asked the girl if she had ever seen slime that couldn't take the required shape and continued to spread. However, without waiting for an answer, the main character said that she would provide Erica with everything she needed for these 3 days, and if she succeeded, the girl would guarantee her a bright future. But the girl seriously doubted that she would succeed, to which Lillian interrupted and said that everything would work out, because she believed in her. Brandon, hearing all this, thought about it because he also believed the girl. And the young man did not understand how the heroine could make such confident statements without a shadow of a doubt. At that moment, Lillian took Erica's hands and warned her that this proposal was her first and last chance to finally see the light of day. Therefore, the main character asked the girl to take responsibility for her own future and make the right choice. Already in the carriage, Lillian said that now all that was left was to wait for good news. However, Brandon still didn't believe in all this and complained that if they didn't succeed, then he had wasted his money. The main character considered the young man's thoughts pessimistic, while he himself said that the girl gives him false hope, and there is no confidence. After all, the young man believed that he had wasted his money by picking up a random person from the slums. Lillian immediately asked if Brandon had ever gambled. After all, everything that happens, as well as the bets, since it is unknown what cards the other person has, and therefore one can only guess the outcome. And the higher the stake in a situation that others consider impossible, the greater the chance of hitting the jackpot. By comparing it to gambling, the heroine explained that they had nothing to lose, so they could raise the stakes. Then, laughing, Lillian called herself the most fearsome player at the card table. Brandon still doubted because the main character is a child who can't even pronounce a word properly, and here she speaks of her complete confidence. So the young man decided to change the subject and asked about the gift, but the girl did not understand what he was talking about. And Brandon reminded that Lillian left under the pretext of buying a gift for the captain, and since the guy told Liv everything, the Duke was definitely expecting a surprise. Hearing this, the main character immediately tensed up and began to actively consider the assistant's words, and realized that, at the very least, Olivia already knew everything. And Lillian suggested that Brandon's words were a hint at being a double agent, which she thought was bold. Therefore, the girl decided not to tell the young man any secrets, and the guy himself at that moment talked about the gift and the difficulties in buying something worthwhile because of the time. After thinking it over, Lillian heard the young man and agreed with his words. And since there was nothing to buy in the evening, the main character said that she would have to find a way out of this situation. Already at the estate, the Duke was surprised by Lillian's appearance at such a late hour and inquired about the reason for her arrival. The girl told him that she had gone to the city today without the man knowing, and Hart, avoiding details about obtaining information at Olivia's request, replied that he already knew everything. The heroine thanked the Duke for accepting her as his daughter-in-law and explained that this was why she wanted to give him a gift. But Lillian continued, suggesting that there was no gift that was perfect for Von Hart. And the Duke immediately guessed that Lillian had not bought anything, but she had thought of everything. So the heroine said that she couldn't take a photo of the man, so she drew a picture. Lillian then immediately presented her gift, which featured an image of the Duke himself. However, looking at the picture, the man could not say anything or react in any way for a long time. After all, the picture was drawn in such a way that the Duke did not understand who was depicted there and tried to figure it out. And Hart assumed that the drawing showed a demon, which immediately left the heroine speechless. Although Lillian knew that there was no point in expecting a man to respond appropriately to a given situation, the main thing was that she tried. So the girl explained that it was Hart who was depicted in the picture, but the Duke asked again, as he was not sure that he had understood everything correctly. And the main character repeated, saying that she had drawn Von Hart. Lillian herself knew that it sounded stupid, but she had no choice but to draw the Duke, because there was little time. So, given the circumstances, the girl decided to play her trump card and, playing the role of an upset child, began to talk about her poor drawing skills. And continuing, the heroine said that if Hart doesn't like the drawing, she can take it back. However, the Duke grabbed the piece of paper, despite the fact that he had previously thought that a demon was drawn on it. And then the man said that he liked the drawing and that it touched his heart. The heroine was shocked that the Duke still told her to leave the drawing with him, although at first he couldn't even make out who was drawn there. And while the girl was thinking, Hart called her over, which distracted her from her thoughts, and she looked at the man. The Duke continued and asked for clarification whether this was a gift of gratitude, to which Lillian immediately responded in the affirmative. Hearing this, Von Hart asked the main character to draw more such pictures when she had free time. The girl herself was taken aback by such a request and froze in place. After all, Lillian couldn't understand what the Duke was going to do with such drawings, especially in large quantities. However, smiling, the main character said that she could make drawings at any time for her father. At this time, Olivia, sitting on the couch and minding her own business, heard Brandon's voice, which attracted her attention. And heading into the room, the guy said that he intended to talk. The girl was surprised and asked about the purpose of such a late visit, warning that she needed to take care of the young lady. However, Brandon said that he had just come to talk about Lillian. And continuing, the young man said that earlier the girl had asked the maid about her family's arrival from their hometown. The girl immediately confirmed this and added that she was really looking forward to meeting her relatives, since she hadn't seen them for a long time. Lillian was delighted with this news and asked the maid if she could go and meet her family with her. After all, the girl always takes care of the main character, so she would like to look at her loved ones at least once. And having told everything, Brandon said that because of this he would have to leave for a short time, but asked his wife not to worry because she could easily transform into one of the family members. However, Olivia was upset and outraged that Lillian only suggested this to Brandon and had never said anything like this to her during her time as her servant. The young man assumed that the heroine was simply bored of sitting in the room all the time on this rainy day, and besides, children at such a young age cannot stay in one place. Hearing this, Olivia agreed, because she realized that it was better to go outside even on such a day, since it was boring in the estate anyway. After these words, Brandon asked the girl about the Duke's condition. And Olivia said that everything was as usual. The man had closed all the curtains because of the sudden rain and was drinking Calvados alone. But still, the assistant was worried whether everything would be okay with the young master that day. However, almost immediately the girl assumed that the rain would soon end, so everything should be fine. After some time, Lillian and the maid arrived at the station. Ethan, upon entering the building, immediately offered his hand to the main character, for which she thanked him and entered. The girl began to look around and examine everything with admiration, since she had not been to the station for a long time, which aroused considerable interest. And as soon as Lillian stepped forward from everyone, the maid immediately called Ethan by name. The boy found this voice very familiar, and he immediately turned around in shock. And to the knight's assumption that this was his father, Brandon confirmed these words. Ethan immediately realized that the man had decided to transform into a maid this time and asked about meeting the family. To which Brandon explained that the family history had to be made up in a hurry, so he simply hired actors. And finally, the man asked Ethan to pretend that he did not know that the maid was actually his father. The girl then turned to Lillian and announced that she would now be accompanying her. So continuing, Hannah said that her sister was waiting for her opposite the station. At this time, the heroine agreed with everything and asked the maid if she had managed to convince her real family. And the girl immediately replied with a smile that everything worked out because she had honed her acting skills. Already sitting in the cafe, Hannah introduced her younger sister Erica to the main character. The girl put the brick on the table and explained that she was worried about Hannah, who works in such a big mansion, so she prepared herbal medicine in her town. Lillian, calling Erica very caring, turned to Ethan and asked him to get some egg tarts from the bakery while they chatted. The boy was surprised, so he asked again to clarify, and the heroine explained that this was the same egg cake that takes more than an hour to prepare. If this cake is cooked properly, it will make a wonderful crispy sound when you slowly dip the tip of a knife into it. And while Ethan was trying to understand everything that was happening, Lillian continued and said that when you cut a cake in two, you can see airy cream inside. The girl also added that she wanted this dessert from the moment she arrived at the station and that she couldn't ask anyone else except Ethan. The young knight accepted the request and left, hoping that since his father was there, everything would be okay. And when the boy left, the main character decided not to delay and get down to business. Erica said that her guesses were confirmed, but she still didn't expect that the heroine was Duke Hart's bride and was very surprised. To which Lillian explained that she had decided not to say anything because she assumed the girl would not stop bowing to her. Then the heroine asked how things were going with the medicine, to which Erica was pleased and said that when testing for mucus, the result was ideal. And hearing this, Lillian said that if everything worked with the slime, then it means that the medicine can be tried on people. However, Brandon did not like this attitude towards monsters, but he remained silent. At this point, the main character continued and asked the girl to tell more about the medicine. So Erica explained that the substance in the flask had the same composition as the slime, so thanks to Lillian, she was able to narrow down the search and everything went more smoothly. When the slime absorbs the root of a plant called Photinia, it exhibits abnormal reactions, and the moisture in its body quickly evaporates, causing it to lose shape and begin to melt, much like Brandon's situation. The main character immediately realized that Brandon was in the same state as the slime that was absorbing Photinia. And that day, Lillian immediately noticed that the young man was like melting slime, which surprised her greatly. After all, something similar happened around this time in the girl's past life. The phenomenon of melting slime has spread across the continent. The predictors associated this phenomenon with the coming end of humanity, and for the Empire this turned into a huge problem. It was Erica who then academically proved this phenomenon, thereby making a name for herself in the scientific community. But still this thesis was published as the achievement of her stepfather. Lillian also suggested that in the past, Brandon had researched poisons that people could ingest, but he was unable to discover the poison itself and therefore, the antidote. Having thought everything over, the heroine turned to Erica and praised her, to which the girl responded with gratitude for the support and noted that this was the happiest time in her life. After these words, Lillian immediately said that if everything was really so, then Erica would now be happy all her life. And continuing, the main character explained that she would ensure that the girl continued to do the research that she loved so much, since they had become close. Lillian then asked Erica to let her know if her stepfather tried to restrain her in any way so that the heroine could take care of it. Brandon noticed that the main character was becoming like a duke and considered this a clear disadvantage of homeschooling. At that moment, Erica assumed that there was a high probability that she and her stepfather would never see each other again. After the knights took the man away, Erica talked to her mother, and she decided that she didn't need a husband who beat her daughter. The main character was very happy with this news, and she said that she would start preparing the laboratory. However, Lillian asked that her orders always be a priority, even when the girl becomes incredibly famous, to which she became a little embarrassed and thanked her for believing in her. And continuing, Erica said that for such help and support, she would try very hard to be useful. The heroine immediately smiled and thought that if she could lure someone as talented as Erica to her side from the very beginning, then in the future she would be able to achieve everything she wanted. At this point, the conversation ended, and Lillian and Brandon were already heading outside to head home. The main character herself looked at the sky and realized that the future continues to change, because now Erica will not be known as an unlucky genius, and she will not die early. With the payment the Duke will give Lillian in the divorce, she will be able to live comfortably for the rest of her life. But the girl will never know what the future holds and how things will be with her relatives. After all, even though Henry and Vanessa have calmed us down now, they will definitely create problems in the end. And Lillian's decisions can create a butterfly effect, and now she cannot predict how everything will turn out. But still the girl believed that it was not yet time to reveal her plan. However, in order for the main character to ultimately have enough strength for revenge, she cannot do without Brandon's help. So Lillian did not hesitate and asked the young man to do her a favor, to which he replied that she could ask him for anything. And the heroine, having said that she wanted to come up with an acrostic with one word, asked the young man to give her the initial syllable. Brandon was surprised by this request, but he still named the first syllable, but the girl repeated the word and waited for him to continue. This shocked the young man even more, and he said the last letter of the word. Having heard what she wanted, Lillian was delighted and handed over the antidote, saying that if Brandon took it and survived, he would become her subordinate. The young man was confused and asked again to make sure he had heard everything correctly. The main character immediately confirmed what was said and explained that she wanted to be treated like a duke. However, Brandon assumed that if he refused, the girl would not give him the antidote and asked about it, but Lillian said that the medicine belonged to him anyway, and there was no need to worry about it. After all, the heroine does not resort to manipulation, and she does not strive to build a relationship with the young man in this way. Lillian just wants to see a capable person next to her who would become her subordinate and not betray her. Therefore, the girl asked Brandon not to worry, since she was not asking to betray the Duke, and she had no intention of opposing him or spreading any confidential information. The heroine herself at that moment understood that because she looked like a child, she could not act openly outside the home, but with the help of someone talented, she would be able to act more actively. Brandon himself was interested in where the nickname Calvados came from, and he asked about it. However, suddenly the young man felt a strange feeling and froze in worry, stopping speaking. The young man's face began to melt, so he dropped his bag from his hands and immediately grabbed his skin. Seeing this, Lillian said that it was for the best, because to test that the medicine was working, there was nothing more effective than drinking it when the illness was getting worse. The girl also recalled Erica's words about how, when she experimented with mucus, the medicine worked immediately after administration. But despite everything, Brandon stopped the main character and told her that he still had questions for her. Lillian herself noticed Ethan at that moment and, in order to hurry the young man, informed him of her son's approach. And since the heroine assumed that the young man did not want to show the boy what state his face was in, she asked him to take the antidote quickly. However, Brandon was afraid that nothing would work, to which the girl replied that they would not have time to find another cure, so everything would be decided today. So either the young man will recover and join the main character, or he will keep his family in the dark and die. And continuing, Lillian said that there was no point in hesitating, because the worst-case scenario could not be avoided anyway. The girl also recalled that she had previously said that the less you lose, the more freely you can raise your stakes. Therefore, there is no need to be afraid, and such an opportunity only happens once in a lifetime. So now the young man should be more confident. A few seconds later, Ethan came up with the cakes, but Lillian immediately said that he could keep them. The boy was surprised because he had bought the baked goods especially for the heroine, to which she explained that she had already eaten too much, since there were a lot of desserts in the cafe. However, after these words, Lillian became a little worried, as she had been very enthusiastic about the cakes and thought it was strange to refuse them like that. At that moment, Ethan turned his gaze to Brandon and asked what was happening with the maid. Hearing this, the main character also immediately turned her attention to the servant and assumed that she was deep in thought after meeting her sister. The girl herself began to think that the medicine did not work and she did not like it. Lillian also immediately considered the option that the antidote did not suit Brandon, but still decided to simply wait for the young man. And at that moment, the young man turns around and confirms the heroine's words, saying that he was overwhelmed with emotions and could not hold back his tears. The girl realized that everything worked and was happy, but still asked Brandon about his condition, to which the young man replied that everything was fine and he had come to his senses. Ethan, watching this, was very surprised and stopped understanding what was happening a little, since it seemed to him that his father had gotten too into character. But the boy decided not to focus on this and looked at the box of cakes, not believing that he could eat all of it. Then the young knight turned his gaze to Lillian and, blushing a little, realized that she was a good person because only such people share food. The heroine decided not to linger any longer and took out an umbrella, suggesting they go home. However, Ethan noticed a strange light coming from the girl and asked about it. It was the pendant from the vow ceremony, which immediately rose into the air and shone even brighter, causing Lillian to panic a little. The girl immediately remembered the Duke's words that she would now be able to find Karen at any moment, and would also be nearby when he needed her, and she realized that this was all for a reason. And just a second later, the main character's thoughts were confirmed, and she found herself next to the young lord. Lillian immediately began to look around, and realizing that she was in an alley, was very surprised. But suddenly the girl noticed Karen's condition and worriedly asked if he could hear her. Then the heroine sat down closer to the boy and asked him how many fingers there were on her hand. However, the young lord himself showed character, and instead of answering, he sternly asked Lillian to stay away from him. After these words, the girl calmed down a little, because if he said that, then everything was okay with him. But the main character was still worried about the condition of Karen's body, as it was covered in wounds, and she assumed that he had been in a fight. And Lillian found all this strange, so she asked the boy why he was holding back and not showing his legionnaire abilities, to which the young lord immediately explained that if he did not restrain himself, he would become like his father. The heroine was surprised by this and asked again, and Karen said that that day was no different from today. It was raining in exactly the same way, and the boy's mother lay dead in the Duke's arms. Lillian saw that it was difficult for Karen to talk about this and tried to stop him, but he continued and explained that during the rain, this scene was before his eyes, and that day keeps replaying in his head, and the boy can't even move. After these words, the young lord fell silent and continued to look down. But the main character did not hesitate, and covering Karen with an umbrella said that everything was fine. And then Lillian suggested that the boy return home. The young lord, looking at the main character, noticed that she was very similar to one person. The girl immediately thought about these words, and an idea arose in her head. So Lillian immediately asked Karen if he was talking about the man who helped him on the day of the massacre. Hearing this, the boy became wary and asked how the heroine knew all this, to which she panicked a little. But in the end, the girl, deciding not to give away the Duke, replied that she had simply heard this information by accident. Karen immediately frowned and tried to understand who was spreading gossip, because he really didn't like that. However, Lillian herself interrupted the boy and, holding out her hand, asked him to wait. After these words, the main character touched Karen's cheek and realized that he still had a fever. The young lord was angered by this and immediately jumped back, but the girl continued and said that she was not sure that it was precisely this temperature because of the heat, and suggested that she simply had warm hands. But Lillian still decided to cure Karen just like last time. Hearing this, the boy immediately remembered that day and did not like this idea very much. Therefore, Karen decided to remind the heroine that she fainted then, and he does not want to repeat that situation now. However, Lillian confidently said that everything would be fine today and asked to trust her. After all, last time this happened because the main character often used her abilities without realizing her limits, but now she did not heal anyone and maintained her strength with good nutrition and sleep. But as soon as the girl began to act, she again felt nausea and the sensation that she was being sucked into a black swamp. And at that moment, Lillian's heart was squeezed into a cold vice. Karen, seeing this, became worried and immediately asked the main character to let him go. However, the girl began to actively refuse. And even when Lillian began to cry from pain and the young lord asked her to stop again, she still stood her ground. After all, the heroine believed that she had to endure until the very end and cure the boy, since this was the main condition of the contract, and if nothing worked out, it would be cancelled. And feeling everything that Karen was experiencing, Lillian couldn't understand how he could act so naturally if he was in so much pain. So the girl assumed that the young lord had learned to ignore pain, just like she had, but she still hoped that this was not the case. Having thought about this, the main character, with the last of her strength, began to tell Karen about the seriousness of his wound. And then Lillian asked the boy not to suffer and not to let anyone beat him. At this time, the maids were actively cleaning the estate, and one of the girls asked if Karen was still in her room, to which the colleague immediately told him that the young lord never goes out until the rain stops. However, another servant interrupted the girls and told them to talk less, because on such days it was better not to be caught doing nothing. And at that moment the door opened wide and Karen appeared on the threshold with the main character in his arms. The boy did not explain anything and asked to call a doctor immediately. On this day, the young lord came to the Duke's estate for the first time of his own free will. After all, before this, Karen swore to himself that he would never return to the place where the man he least wanted to call his father lived. But when the boy realized that Lillian had taken his wounds, the oath had to be broken, because the only place that came to the young lord's mind was the Duke's estate. The place Karen hated the most was the only place where he could get help, and he found it very insulting. After thinking it over, the young lord remembered his father's words on the day of their first meeting with Lillian. Then the Duke explained to the boy that the heroine does not use magic, but is a legionary healer. And continuing, the man asked Karen to keep the girl close because she would be useful to him. However, the young lord did not understand how exactly the heroine would be useful. After all, before this, not a single legionary healer was known. Now Karen realized that if the abilities simply transferred wounds from the healer to the legionnaire, then Lillian took all the pain that he felt at that moment. And the boy was surprised that, knowing about all this and having personally experienced it, the heroine still decided to marry him. However, Karen's thoughts were interrupted by Lillian, who began calling out to someone in her sleep. The girl began to fidget violently and ask Edmund why he did it. The young lord, realizing that this was a man's name, immediately jumped up and became nervous. At this moment, Karen had many questions in his head because he was trying to understand who Lillian was talking about. And the boy immediately assumed that Edmund was the one the main character had loved before. After all, among the nobility, conversations about marriage begin at a much earlier age. Karen himself considered Lillian very naive, and therefore thought that the girl gave her consent because she was unable to refuse. But the more time the heroine spent with Edmund, the more irresponsible love she developed. From these thoughts, the young lord began to get angry, and feeling this, he froze, because he did not understand why he was doing something like this. However, the main character began to cough, and continued to talk about what was bothering her. But Karen ignored this, as he noticed something that surprised him much more. It was a white flower that was in Lillian's hair. After some time, the heroine woke up from the cold and was surprised that it was already night. Seeing this, Karen immediately told the girl not to get up, but Lillian herself was interested in whether she had a temperature. The young lord found this a little strange and asked if the heroine herself felt what was happening to her. To which Lillian, still clutching her head, said that she was sure that she was not sick. And the boy immediately asked about the rapid healing of wounds. And the heroine explained that she usually doesn't stagger like that, so she considers Karen a special case. After all, when Lillian uses her abilities on the young lord, she feels more pain than usual, cold and sticky. Karen called these feelings obvious, since the girl took his wounds. After these words, the heroine became a little worried and asked the boy if he saw all of this, to which he responded indignantly, because she was crying from pain and it was hard not to notice. Lillian was surprised by the young lord's reaction and did not understand why he was so angry. Since Karen had been showing far less compassion all this time, the girl assumed that he simply couldn't bear to see someone in pain in front of him. After all, for the boy, the heroine is just a means by which he can live peacefully without the princess and pain, so she believed that Karen should only be glad that the wounds were transferred to her. So Lillian asked the boy if he was worried about her, but he just asked again, uncomprehendingly. But the main character immediately realized that Karen was definitely worried, since he stayed with her until late, and earlier put a wet towel. Continuing, the girl told about the first time she was given a wet towel when she was sick. And Lillian had always wondered what it felt like. So now she was surprised that it was cold. Karen didn't like that the heroine was laughing, and he asked the reason, to which she explained that she was happy because he was there when she was in pain. Then the girl thanked the young lord, and he immediately blushed, turning his face away completely. But after a couple of seconds, Karen suddenly changed the subject and asked about the flower that was in his hand. And when Lillian said it was a small white flower, the boy told her that she had coughed it up in her sleep. The main character was shocked by this and asked again, but Karen only calmly repeated what he had said earlier. Continuing, the young lord noted that the likelihood that the girl was hungry and ate the flower was small, so he asked if she had any options for the appearance of the plant. And after hearing the negative answer, Karen also told Lillian that she had coughed up more than one flower, so he gave the rest to the doctor and he should find out what was going on. At this point, the boy decided to finish and told the heroine to rest, warning that he would call the doctor. But Lillian believed that the doctor needed to sleep at night too, so she grabbed Karen's hand and stopped him. And as soon as the young lord turned to the main character, she pointed to the bed and told him to lie down next to her. The boy didn't understand anything, but Lillian explained that he needed to get a good night's sleep first, and then they would think about what was happening. However, Karen, although he had already started to go to bed, still asked why he had to lie down here. And the heroine again said that the young lord looked tired and it would be better to sleep and then decide what to do first. Lillian also noted that the bed is wide enough, so there shouldn't be any problems. And while Karen tried to accept what was happening, the girl thought about the Duke's words. After all, if the heroine could, she would sleep alone. But the man vacated the couple's original rooms and now Karen can only sleep with her. But suddenly the boy interrupted Lillian's thoughts and asked who Edmund was. The main character immediately sat up and asked again, to which Karen hesitantly suggested that she knew this young man. The girl herself did not understand why the young lord so unexpectedly started talking about her brother. Because unlike the Duke, who knows absolutely everything about the Lillian family, Karen knows absolutely nothing. Besides, the young lord doesn't get along with his father, so the heroine realized that he most likely never heard anything about it. Karen continued and asked if the guy was bad and if he hit Lillian, but the girl immediately began to deny this, saying that Edmund was not like that at all and that in fact he was a very good person. The young lord became a little tense and, asking again, decided to clarify whether Lillian liked the boy. To this question, the main character immediately smiled and enthusiastically, without hesitation, answered yes. This shocked Karen and, frozen in place, he tried to understand what was so obvious about all this. And the boy immediately thought that in the Lanches family it is considered normal to love two people at the same time. However, at that moment, Lillian interrupted the young lord's thoughts and decided to explain her words. Continuing, the main character told that Edmund is her younger brother, but Karen decided to remain silent about this. And a second later, the boy laid Lillian down on the pillow and told her not to get up, as her temperature still hadn't gone down. The young lord also asked the girl to continue calling him by his name. Adding, Karen noted that the heroine knows his name because she likes him and not calling the name of her crush is strange. Lillian immediately agreed and said that the boy's name was Karen von Hart. The young lord confirmed and named the main character, thereby reminding her that she was his wife. Karen went on to say that the Hart family had enjoyed good health for generations. Therefore, blushing and looking away, the young lord asked the girl not to get sick without his permission. Lillian herself silently watched her husband and noticed that he blushed even more. At this time, the boy had already started to go to bed and told the heroine that it was time to stop talking and rest, otherwise the temperature could rise even more. But Lillian thought about what she had noticed since the moment they met, that Karen was not being honest with her at all. Since the only one who has a fever right now is the young lord, not the main character. At this point, the dialogue between the guys really ended and they slept together until the morning. Karen was the first to open his eyes to the sunlight shining through the window, and realizing that he had fallen asleep and slept with Lillian until the morning, the boy immediately sat up and tried to understand how this had happened. After all, for the young lord all this was impossible due to the fact that his mother died in this mansion. And from that moment on, Karen was never able to sleep soundly, so what was happening now surprised him greatly. Turning his gaze to Lillian, the boy realized that she really did make him nervous all the time. As soon as the main character woke up, a doctor came to her and noted that her condition was much better than yesterday. The man also said that the wounds were healing very well, but Lillian should still focus on recovery and rest. Karen, approaching the girl, suggested that she slept more than usual due to fatigue, but the heroine said that she always sleeps a lot and this is her usual state. But the young lord did not like it, and he also thought that because of hunger, Lillian decided to eat flowers, so he ordered the maid to quickly prepare the food. The main character immediately frowned at this assumption, since she had never eaten flowers and, moreover, they remained in their original form. At that moment, Karen remembered that the girl had previously said that she was a secret, hidden even from the imperial family, and decided to clarify this. However, without waiting for an answer, the young lord immediately began to swear, because he was worried that Lillian would have no one to help her if someone found out about her abilities and kidnapped her. But the main character was completely calm and, smiling, said that in that case, Karen himself would help her. The boy was so confused and began to resent it because he thought otherwise and was not going to save Lillian because he didn't even like her. The heroine, getting out of bed, reminded the young lord that she was his wife and he had no choice. After all, if something suddenly happens to the girl, it will be natural for Karen to help her. The young lord, at this moment, noticing that Lillian had gotten out of bed so fearlessly, indignantly asked her to be more careful, as he was afraid that she would break her ankle. However, the main character said that she is not made of crystal, so it is not worth taking such good care of her. Then the girl opened the window and explained that even if it was raining outside, the room needed to be ventilated, and suddenly something really caught Lillian's attention. Therefore, the heroine immediately turned towards Karen and asked him to come to her. There was a rainbow outside the window, which the girl considered, although small, very beautiful, like a painting. But the young lord was not impressed by the natural phenomenon at all, and this upset Lillian, and she did not understand why he underestimated the rainbow so much because it can only be seen now. The main character also said that even if the clouds gather, it does not change the fact that the sky is blue. Therefore, darkness is just a moment that must be experienced. After these words, the girl turned to Karen and asked if he thought the rainbow was beautiful. However, the young lord was so amazed by Lillian's speech that he simply stood silently, looking at her. And yet, after a couple of seconds, the boy agreed that the rainbow was indeed beautiful. At this time, Brandon entered the Duke's office, reporting that the rain had already stopped. The man replied that he knew about it, and the young man continued, saying that he had come to talk about Lillian. Hart immediately turned his gaze to his assistant and asked if he had found out anything about the girl. And Brandon said that he had been watching from the sidelines the whole time and realized that the main character was in no way connected with the doctor. Hearing this, the Duke immediately stood up and asked the reason for such confidence, to which the young man explained that the girl saw the doctor in front of her and it seemed to him that she did not know him. Continuing, the young man noted that a legionnaire with such unique abilities was highly valued by doctors. On the contrary, if they learn about the abilities, like 6 years ago, they can commit madness again. After these words, Hart said that in that case he would also do one crazy thing to catch this man. The doctor himself was obsessed with the Legionnaires, so 6 years ago he kidnapped Iris and Karen. And despite the fact that the woman was an ordinary person, she fell into the doctor's hands because she was with the young lord at the time. Therefore, remembering the past, the Duke's heart, which seemed completely insensitive, breaks into millions of pieces. But at that moment, Brandon interrupted the man's thoughts, saying that he had one more thing he needed to know. Continuing, the young man recalled the covenant ceremony that had been conducted using ancient magic. And although the young man was not sure whether he understood everything correctly, he still reported that the last time Lillian disappeared, and he assumed that she went to Karen. Brandon also added that the boys were now at home, but at that moment, the man was most interested in their condition. To which the young man replied that Karen was not only fine, but also full of energy. However, it was important for the Duke to know Lillian's condition, so he asked about her, and this shocked the young man very much. After all, Hart never worried about anyone but his family. And despite the shock, Brandon said the girl fainted again, but luckily she's okay now. The young man then suggested that the main character's body could not withstand the stress of using her abilities. But the Duke interrupted the young man and asked him to call Olivia to his office, because the man will have to return. At this moment, Karen and Lillian were actively discussing the room, and the boy did not understand what the heroine meant. After all, the young lord was sure that this was his room, but the heroine did not agree with this and explained that, to be precise, it was theirs. Having said this, the girl began to laugh and repeat that this room was now theirs to share, but Karen was unhappy and asked how this happened. And after a short pause, Lillian reminded them that they were married and therefore should live together. But the heroine herself did not consider this a problem, since the bed was wide and could accommodate 10 people. The girl also said that yesterday during their shared sleep everything was fine, to which Karen immediately became embarrassed and began to come up with an excuse for what happened. However, seeing Lillian's upset eyes, the young lord immediately fell silent, and out of confusion, Karen was unable to find the words to say what he had planned. Suddenly there was a knock on the door, asking the main character if they could come in. The boy immediately turned towards the source of the sound and asked who had come at such a late hour. Lillian, seeing that it was Hannah, immediately called her name joyfully and headed towards her. After greeting him, the maid showed Karen out the door and was glad that he left quickly. However, the heroine did not consider this surprising, because Hannah told the boy that Lillian would now be changing clothes, and that was why he immediately ran out. And as soon as the young man transformed back into his original form, the heroine noticed that he was not hiding his identity at all. But this did not bother the girl at all, since she had become accustomed to all the transformations of the young man. Lillian also realized that since Brandon had come at such a late hour, it could only mean one thing. The restriction imposed on the young man by the doctor is temporary until today, and already at midnight the fate of the young man will be decided. Brandon decided to remind the main character about her sudden disappearance. And then the young man suggested that Ethan was very surprised and was still walking around in the dark. Hearing this, Lillian immediately realized that only 2 people close to the Duke really knew about the contract between her and him. At this point, the young man continued and warned the heroine that Ethan was so shy that he might not say anything, so when she saw him, she should tell him how she was feeling. Brandon also said that Ethan is the second treasure in his life, which is why he cares so much about him. And when the main character asked who the first treasure was, the young man immediately named Olivia. The day the girl agreed to marry Brandon was the brightest day in his life, and the young man still cannot believe that Olivia confessed her feelings to someone like him, but at that moment there was no one happier than him. After these words, Lillian asked the young man why he was not with his wife now, to which Brandon replied that he couldn't do that because she would be sad when he died. And with a heavy heart, the young man continued, saying that he did not want Olivia to be sad. Hearing this, the heroine was also upset, because she realized that the young man sincerely loves his family and he cannot die. Moreover, Brandon almost died when he was poisoned by the doctor, and Erica's medicine was able to slow down the symptoms of the poison. But this medicine also had side effects, and the young man had a very hard time all this time. And although outwardly it seemed that the young man accepted this calmly, he was able to survive only because he wanted to be with his family. The time limit set by the doctor will come to an end, however. Today's situation is different from his previous life, when Brandon was forced to die helplessly. And now the young man has a chance for salvation, which makes the main character immensely happy. The clock showed exactly 12, but Lillian did not notice any changes in the young man. Therefore, breathing a sigh of relief, the girl immediately beamed with a smile. And while Brandon himself stood in shock, the heroine said that he still couldn't make Olivia cry. But the young man was not very talkative for the first few seconds, and this made Lillian a little wary, so she simply watched him questioningly. However, Brandon then smiled and noted that he had lost in the end. Now, according to the agreement, the young man will become the main character's subordinate. But the young man warned Lillian that if she wanted to betray the captain, he would not do it. After all, once, because of Brandon's unique abilities, he was kidnapped by that same doctor. And the man who pulled the young man out of there was Duke von Hart. Therefore, the young man will not betray his captain under any circumstances. After finishing his story, Brandon turned his gaze to the main character and called her by name. And continuing, the young man asked the girl to beware of the doctor, because this man is obsessed with the Legionnaires, and if he finds out about Lillian, he will torment her. After these words, Brandon assumed that the heroine clearly did not want to be experimented on. So, having transformed himself into a doctor, the young man told Lillian to run without thinking if she saw this face. At this time, in the imperial castle of Lembrana, Gloria was rushing to her brother, and as soon as the girl entered the room, she immediately asked about the young man's condition. To which the boy immediately smiled and showed his joy at his sister's presence. It was Elliot Lembrana who was the second prince. Gloria immediately came up and took the book from her brother, saying that now was not the time to read it, since Karen was getting married. Having attracted attention, the girl began to remember everything about Lillian, but the only thing she remembered was that the heroine was from a family she had never heard of. After these words, Elliot expressed regret to Gloria that her beloved Duke had married, but the princess did not like it and considered it nonsense. Hearing this, the young man was confused because he did not understand why his sister was angry and asked about it. And as soon as Gloria said that everything had become more complicated now, the boy understood the complexity and exhaled tensely. At this point, the princess continued and, naming her status, repeated that she was going to marry the man who had now married a homeless girl. That's why Gloria will never be able to admit this. Besides, the princess received everything she wanted throughout her life. The girl took everything for herself, regardless of whether it was a thing or a person. And now Gloria believed that Duke Hart's only son, a legionnaire, was simply destined to be connected to her. But the princess could not even think that Lillian would get ahead of her, so she was very upset and angry. Elliot understood all this perfectly well, but reminded her that even her father had given permission for this marriage, and now the girl could do nothing. But Gloria herself was sure that the problem was precisely in her father, because he had called the Duke to him, but looking at his face, he simply remained silent. What the princess found even more terrible was that a man saw no point in interfering in personal affairs. And these words angered the girl even more, because no matter how great Duke Hart was, he was not an emperor, and if Lillian did something, she would not be able to go unpunished. But Elliot interrupted his sister and reminded her that the Duke was one of the most cold-blooded people, who not only killed many legionnaires, but also his father and wife. Also, the legionnaires in general do not care about human lives, so the Emperor behaves cautiously with von Hart. However, Gloria noted that the Duke had killed his wife was just a rumor, but the boy did not think it was completely false. And then Elliot asked if the princess had ever spoken to Marcel, to which she shouted at him to forbid him from mentioning her older brother, because the young man's reaction to the wedding of the young Lord Gloria was not pleasing. After all, Marcel believed that Karen was not the only suitable option for the princess, and that she was still young, so she did not need to rush. And after quoting these words to Elliot, the girl said that she had never heard anything more stupid and that it really irritated her. After this was said, Gloria thought, and began to compare the two brothers. After all, Elliot supported the princess and decided that if she really liked Karen so much, then they would figure out what could be done, and this already sounded much more pleasant to her. Although absolutely everyone tells Gloria to avoid Elliot, and after one incident with him, she began to hear such words more often. Also, after what happened, even the now deceased mother changed her attitude and turned away from the young man. And the young man's situation worsened considerably, which was natural and expected. But for Gloria, Elliot is the one who treats her like an ordinary person, even though she is a legionnaire. During this time, the guy thought everything over and noticed something strange. Therefore, continuing, the prince noted that the young lord was still underage and there was no need to rush into marriage. Gloria immediately agreed and said that Lillian seemed a little cheeky and cute, but nothing more. Elliot decided not to miss the moment and asked his sister the name of Karen's wife, to which she immediately gave her first and last name. Hearing this, the young man laughed, as he realized that the princess was only pretending not to remember the details about the main character. However, literally a second later, the young man thought and tried to remember whether he had heard the name Lanches before. And since all had failed, Elliot told Gloria that she really didn't know much about Lillian. Therefore, the young man suggested to his sister that she introduce the heroine into her social circle. Meanwhile, at the Duke's estate, the room issue had been resolved to some extent, and Karen stopped trying to run away from home, and thanks to this, he and the main character began to meet often. Now the young lord collected flowers for Lillian as a gift, and emotionlessly asked her to take them. And such sudden actions from Karen became quite frequent for the girl from the moment their life together began. Therefore, having accepted the bouquet, the heroine asked the boy why suddenly there were flowers, to which he, continuing not to look into the eyes, said that he simply picked them up. However, the maid knew and understood everything, so, leaning closer to Lillian, she told her that these were flowers from the Duke's garden. Continuing, the girl noted that recently many flowers had been blooming, and the girl immediately responded enthusiastically to this, saying that she wanted to see them. Hearing this, the servant immediately suggested that the main character go for a walk in the garden and went to prepare everything for going outside. After some time, Lillian was already walking around the garden and admiring its appearance. And the girl did not regret at all that she went out, because the scent of the flowers was so sweet and the heroine herself felt very calm. The only thing that worried Lillian was that Karen was acting like a stranger, and that he had previously shown with his whole appearance that he didn't want to, but still walked with her. The young lord reminded the girl very much of a stray cat. After all, if you approach Karen first, he will immediately run away and not approach. But if you pretend not to notice the boy, he immediately approaches. Just like now, since the main character could offer the young lord a walk, but he is still afraid of her. However, Lillian still decided to take a risk and show that she saw Karen in the hope that he would not run away. And a second later, the heroine turned towards the boy and asked why he didn't wake her up when he went to get flowers to go out together. Remembering all the care and gifts from Karen, Lillian realized that he was more sentimental than he seemed, but at that moment the boy answered her question, calling it nonsense, and this shocked the main character. Then the young lord explained that he was there to find out if the girl had eaten the flowers, and after these words, Lillian realized that she was wrong, because he was a legionnaire, and they were insensitive. But suddenly the main character was visited by memories from her childhood, and she said that she had never eaten flowers. However, continuing, The girl said that despite this, there was something edible in the flowers and reached out to the bush to pick one. Afterwards, Lillian asked Karen to do the same things with the plant that she did. And having finished, the main character showed how to eat this flower, which made the boy freeze in shock. But almost immediately, the young lord began to be indignant, since the girl had previously said that she had never eaten flowers, and now she was doing everything differently. But Lillian responded negatively and explained that this was simply sucking out honey. Then the heroine did not hesitate and brought the plant to Karen's mouth, persistently asking him to try it. In the end, the boy decided to trust his wife and began to hesitantly suck honey from the flower. The young lord himself, at that moment, trying, did not understand why he was doing what he was told, and did not resist. Lillian, seeing that Karen had finished, asked him if he liked the taste, but he remained silent, although in fact he thought the sweetness was not bad. After this, the boy sullenly voiced the assumption that the heroine's family had no money, and that was why she ate the flowers. But the girl was surprised by this opinion, and looking at the young lord with incomprehension, asked again. And Karen immediately explained that usually nobles do not put flowers in their mouths in this way. However, Lillian said that regardless of the Lanches family's wealth, she did it several times when she was a child. The young lord immediately corrected the heroine's words, reminding her that she was still a child, to which she looked at her with displeasure and corrected herself. The time when Lillian was even younger than she is now, and when her stepmother was still alive, was not the happiest period of her life. One day, the woman reproached the main character for lying to her again. And despite the girl's repentance, the stepmother told the servants that she would suffer corporal punishment and asked them to bring something suitable. The woman also ordered the maids not to give Lillian anything to eat all day. However, a hunger strike throughout the day was no longer something special for the main character. The girl always hugged herself at night because she had to endure the night in hunger and cold. But that night, Lillian smelled something sweet coming from the window. Therefore, the main character immediately approached the source of the smell and, seeing the flowers, deeply inhaled their aroma. And without delay, the girl immediately ran out into the street, because when a person is hungry, he simply cannot think rationally. At that moment, even a drop of honey was enough to bring tears to Lillian's eyes. And then the heroine felt the sweetness, but having tried it now, the taste seemed not so bright to her. Karen, watching the girl at that moment, noticed a change in her facial expression and did not understand why she suddenly became less pleased. Lillian herself turned to the young lord and asked if he would soon leave here. After all, the main character understood that even though the boy, for some reason, was diligently sitting at home, he would soon leave again. Because Karen hates her father, and this place belongs to him, the Grand Duke. And after thinking it over, Lillian told the young lord that she understood him, to which he was very surprised. Continuing, the girl said that she also had something, and when she stood on the threshold of death, she was very interested in whether one person would eat peacefully and live well, although the main character herself hates this man so much that she cannot close her eyes. So Lillian pointed out that whether it was a misunderstanding or not, dislike was dislike. And although for the girl the Duke is a person she trusts, she cannot convince Karen of this, because the heroine doesn't want to come between Hart and the young lord, because that wasn't in the contract. However, Lillian suddenly turned to Karen and asked him not to let him hit her. The girl did not understand where the young lord got his wounds from last time, because he was a legionnaire and usually they don't get hit by everyone. But the boy himself considered all this absurd since he was lucky with people who were not afraid of the legionnaires. However, remembering the day Lillian first used her powers on him, Karen didn't understand how she could advise him to save himself from being beaten. So the young lord decided it would be better to ignore the girl's words. But Karen was still worried that the main character was asking him for the second time not to let him beat her, but she couldn't take care of herself. And thinking about this, the boy forbade Lillian to receive blows without his permission. The young lord then explained that when the heroine first used her powers on him, he saw several wounds on her, so he wants to know who hit her when she was at home. Karen also added that if the girl was afraid to return home for this very reason, then she should tell him everything right now. The young lord himself was very angry and determined to find out the name, because whoever this person was, he would kill him. After listening to everything, Lillian asked if the boy was referring to his wounds, which she had transferred to herself. And while Karen stood there in shock, the main character continued and repeated the question, saying that she didn't remember being beaten recently. After these words, the young lord immediately realized everything and blushed deeply, since it was he who was the culprit of all the wounds. However, at that moment, Lillian noticed with a smile that the boy had been a little stupid and thus slightly defused the situation. The main character herself was glad and surprised that Karen was in fact a very conscientious legionnaire. So continuing, the girl asked the young lord not to worry about her, and if the moment comes when no one can help Karen, then he must definitely remember Lillian. After all, then the main character will immediately find the boy and come to the rescue. While sitting at breakfast with Karen, the main character discussed an important topic with him. The young lord asked the girl if she was thinking of divorcing him right away. The main character was not very surprised by this question, but she was interested in the reason for such frequent conversations about this. And referring to her teenage years, the girl asked Karen again about the divorce. The young lord clarified that when the boys grow up, they will get divorced, to which the heroine looked at him in confusion. But as it turned out, it was in Karen's best interests for Lillian to leave the house right now, which left her in shock. The boy himself is going to overthrow the imperial family according to the law, so he asked the heroine not to worry about it. However, Lillian was unhappy with this idea, since an early divorce was tantamount to a breach of contract, and if Lillian is kicked out, that means she won't get any money. Therefore, having hit the table, the heroine was beside herself with this idea and the thought that she was still in the red. So Lillian immediately shouted out that she did not agree to a divorce. The girl also explained that she should never get divorced, because she does not want any stain on her reputation. Therefore, the main character demanded that they never talk about divorce again, to which Karen was shocked. And at that moment, the young lord became wary, because he understood that he could not leave everything as it was under any circumstances. So while Lillian sat there sighing and discontentedly, the boy tried to talk to her and explain that they couldn't legally get a divorce at the moment. However, Karen is sure with all her heart that Hart will kill Lillian, and if not today, then tomorrow. And the boy repeatedly warned the heroine, but she not only does not want to listen, she does not understand him at all. Lillian herself, thinking about the payment she would not receive, told the young lord of her sympathy for him. Karen immediately asked what was so good about him, and the girl realized that he didn't believe her. And since the main character did not expect such a question, she had to remember absolutely everything about Karen. The first thing that came to Lillian's mind was the beauty of the young lord, which made him a little surprised. But even at this, the boy was a little indignant, and the heroine realized that she was in a difficult situation. Karen interrupted the girl's thoughts and asked if she would divorce him if she met someone who was more handsome than him. And while Lillian was surprised that the lord still believed her, the guy himself began to say that there was something else. However, the main character interrupted her husband at the moment when he wanted to tell everything, and so he remained silent. At this moment, Lillian was ready to tell her beautiful and eloquent lie about love. And continuing, the girl noted that when you fall in love, the world and everything around you seems brighter and takes on different colors. But while Lillian was talking about how much her world had changed since Karen came into her life, the boy just looked at his wife with confusion. The heroine herself was perfectly aware that, despite her behavior and words, she did not know love at all. Karen felt awkward about all this, so despite the nice words addressed to him, he demanded that they stop. And seeing the reaction of the young lord, the girl understood that her words were not spoken in vain. Suddenly, while the young couple continued to sit at the table, quick footsteps were heard outside the door. As it turned out, it was a maid who, having run to the guys with a letter, immediately turned to the main character, which scared her a little. So Lillian immediately asked about the urgency, and the girl reported that Princess Gloria had sent a man. And holding out the letter, the maid explained that Gloria had asked her to deliver this envelope. The letter had the royal seal on it, which was like a time bomb for Lillian, to which Karen said they would look at it together. The organizer was Princess Gloria, and the boy grimaced a little when he heard about it. As it turned out, the letter was not what the boys imagined, since it was an invitation to tea. After some time, Lillian was already in the room and appreciated how unexpectedly her dressing room had become a secret refuge. Brandon, however, thought the dressing room looked good and thought that it could easily accommodate just one maid and my lady. Then the young man spoke about what he had already heard about the invitation from the princess and that the heroine had accepted it, to which Lillian had agreed. After all, in the heroine's opinion, she and the princess would have met anyway someday, and it's better not to delay it. And in the future, Gloria will be able to forget her. Brandon tried to understand what the future tea party would be like, but without knowing the princess's temperament, it was difficult. The upper circles are rarely kind to new people, but such events are filled with lords and ladies who have not yet made their debut. The event is aimed primarily at demonstrating status and establishing hierarchy. However, Princess Gloria has missed something since she wants to show all the sprouts their place. Lillian is no longer a sprout, so it will be quite difficult with her in the way that the princess is interested in. And Brandon, having seen more than once how you get 2 blows for everyone, understood that he wouldn't be able to not worry. After all, there wouldn't be even one person on the side of the main character, and this made the young man worry even more. So Brandon asked Lillian if she needed a change of outfit, to which she agreed. But despite the huge amount of new clothes the Duke had bought, the young man considered them completely unsuitable. Since the princess's tea party is ideally comparable to a battlefield, you need to choose the perfect outfit. So Brandon said that Lillian had to look better than the kid next door. The heroine was shocked by these words, and she asked the young man if he was talking about Ethan. Brandon agreed, but specified that Lillian was the lady of this house. And since the young man is the captain's right hand, and his wife is his left hand, the main character can be directly called their child. So Lillian is now as much an honorary part of the Hart family as anyone else. But the girl is also not only part of the Hart family, but also part of the Munez family, which she was pleasantly surprised by. However, despite this, Lillian stood and silently turned these words over in her head. The girl could not believe that the young man was speaking seriously and not for the sake of giving some kind of instructions. After all, it was strange for the heroine that she, too, was now part of the family, and at that moment her heart was pounding wildly and trembling slightly. But suddenly, Lillian was distracted from her thoughts by Brandon calling her name. Continuing, the young man said that he wanted to talk about a flower that the girl had recently coughed up, to which she became a little worried and asked the reason for such a sudden conversation. And the young man explained that he had quietly borrowed one flower and given it to Erica because he thought that she was more capable than an ordinary doctor. Lillian was very surprised by this, because she did not understand how Brandon managed to do everything, but she was glad that even if you do not tell him anything, he does his job well. Brandon also said at this time that Erica was also thinking hard, but she wasn't sure. So the girl stayed up all night doing research, and the young man assumes that she will not rest until she finds everything that was missing in the books. Continuing, the young man added that Erica was a scientist by nature, and Lillian immediately thought about these words. After all, then the main character can already begin to implement her plan. Although the girl had previously thought that she needed to wait a little longer, she now saw that Erica's knowledge and enthusiasm exceeded her expectations. So Lillian decided not to delay and handed the young man a piece of paper with a reminder about the new medicine, asking him to give it to Erica next time. Brandon accepted the request but asked about the type of medicine, and the girl replied that he would find out about it very soon. However, after the main character's words that this was the first mission that the young man could complete, he became a little tense, because all the possible options in the young man's head about what the task might be were not the most positive. But at that moment, the main character broke the silence and said that she needed a second name. Brandon was confused and asked again, to which Lillian explained that she needed a second name that would not arouse suspicion if a large sum of money was coming into it in the near future. And the young man immediately understood that the girl wanted to legalize her illegally obtained money, so he advised her to contact the Duke. After all, when talking to a man on this topic, Lillian learns a lot, since he is the main specialist in this matter. However, the main character immediately abandoned this idea, as she wants to earn a lot of money herself, regardless of the name Lanches. Because in a few years the Lanches family money will belong to Edmund, and although Lillian will not regret that he will become the head of the family, but if she steals the family money, that is a completely different matter. After all, then the heroine will be no different from her maternal uncle, who ran a business with this money, saying that he would later give it back along with the title. And now the girl is afraid to even imagine that she is doing the same thing as the one she hates. However, after thinking it over, Lillian continued and said that she wanted a cash account that would have nothing to do with her and that she planned to work under that name in the future. The heroine will also officially sponsor Erica through this, as she cannot afford to use her uncle's money forever. After these words, Brandon noted that there really were a lot of requirements, and everything needed to be thought through very carefully. The main character agreed and reminded that the main thing was to avoid any suspicions. And on top of that, Lillian will provide reliable support for Brandon's daily wages. Until that moment, the young man himself considered the heroine's words about reliable support to be something very funny. As Gloria's tea party approached, the main character had to go through many events. Throughout this time, Lillian went shopping every day from early morning to choose an outfit, and it already seemed to the girl that Brandon had sworn to arm her. The heroine also noticed that when the young man spends the Duke's money, he looks very happy. However, ever since Lillian began sharing a room with Karen, she had completely stopped seeing Hart's face. Therefore, the girl assumed that the man was avoiding her because the young lord hated his father and the heroine wanted to make sure that everyone lived comfortably in this house. But unfortunately, Karen is a person who is not at all interested in this plan, and now the boy expressed his dissatisfaction with Lillian's frequent walks since she is not yet completely healthy. The heroine, although she didn't understand why the boy was asking since he knew everything, still explained that it happened because she was getting ready for tea. Hearing this, the young lord expressed his opinion and told the girl to ignore this invitation. However, Lillian believed that since the princess had called her, she had no right to simply ignore her. And Karen reminded the heroine that she was the Duke's wife, so they couldn't say anything to her refusal, and Hart had to teach the girl these basics. But Lillian herself understood that in order to be able to marry Karen, she had to give enough of her strength, and she could not foolishly lose to the princess. And when Brandon told the Duke that there would be a tea party, the man said that the heroine could do whatever she wanted. And unlike Von Hart's son, the girl thought this reaction was cool, so now she continued to insist on her own. However, this angered the young lord even more, and he asked if Lillian knew what Gloria was like. But while Karen assumed that the main character would have to be held by force, she happily talked about how this was her first invitation from a peer. It will also be the girl's first time dressing up and attending a tea party, so she doesn't want to refuse. Although in reality, if the main character were Lillian Lanches, she would have refused. But now the girl is Lillian von Hart, and she is in a marriage that cannot be dissolved by law, and the princess is the one who can start the change, so you have to be careful. Karen noticed something at this time and asked the heroine why she had so many things for the first time. After all, both the wet towel during illness and the tea party were the first time for Lillian, and this greatly surprised the young lord. Therefore, after these words, the boy asked if the heroine was really an aristocrat. He also noted that one could say that her family had no money, but it seemed to him that she lived in exile. And to this Lillian said that she had parents, but it was worse than if they had not been there, so all her life she sat at home alone, without friends. But then the main character asked Karen if this was the story he absolutely needed to know. However, the couple's dialogue was suddenly interrupted by a servant who said that a man from the store had arrived. Hearing this, the boy offered Lillian his help, but she replied that she could handle it herself and left. Karen was a little upset, and as soon as the door closed, he realized that the heroine had just drawn a line between them. But if, in the girl's opinion, the young lord doesn't need to know something, then so be it. It's been a while since Karen and Lillian got married, but her family hasn't shown up here and the boy hasn't asked any questions about it, so he has no idea what the heroine's life was like before marriage. So the young lord decided it would be easier to ignore what the girl considered unimportant. But Karen is still interested in Lillian, so he can never ignore it. After all, even if the boy completely turns away from the main character and closes his eyes, he will see how dazzling she is. Thinking about all this, the young lord remembered the conversation at the table and Lillian's words about falling in love, which illuminates the world with new colors. And Karen understood one thing for sure. He wanted to know more about the heroine. After a long time of preparation, the day of Gloria's tea party arrived. All the servants stood in Lillian's room, looking at the final result, while the girl herself asked if she could open her eyes already. Brandon, looking around, realized that even if he one day turns the world upside down, in his life, the heroine was the greatest masterpiece. The maids could hardly contain their thoughts about how beautiful Lillian looked because they considered her a real new ray of light in this dark world. The main character herself looked in the mirror and could not believe what was happening, since this outfit was ideal for fighting. The girl then immediately turned to Brandon and asked if she was worth tens of thousands. However, the young man thought differently and said that Lillian was worth $1 million. But at that moment, the maid interrupted the conversation and warned the main character that it was time to leave, and the carriage was already waiting. Hearing this, the girl immediately smiled and replied that they could go now. Ethan, who was supposed to accompany Lillian today under false pretenses, was waiting by the carriage. And approaching the boy, the main character said that she hoped for good service. But before getting into the carriage, Lillian wondered why Karen hadn't come out to see her off. After all, for some time, the young lord was constantly nearby, but now the girl does not even see his shadow. But since the Duke didn't say anything to the main character, it means Karen didn't run away, so there's no need to worry about that. And the boy's presence is still felt in the room, and since he was against her meeting with Gloria until the end, she will not be able to fully enjoy this day. After some time, Lillian arrived at the princess's palace. The main character arrived exactly on time, not earlier and not later, but Gloria herself was late. Therefore, the maid invited the girl to the table and warned that the princess was still busy, so she would come at the appointed time. However, this was not surprising to Lillian, and she knew that this was exactly how it would be. After all, if Gloria had come early, then the main character would have been scolded for being late, and if the opposite were true, then they would have laughed at her for coming too early. And they always choose one of the two, so the princess chose the latter. Lillian might complain that the invitation stated the wrong tea time, but Gloria would force a grin and say that it was just a small mistake, and that was how she showed her superiority. But the heroine decided not to focus on this and asked Ethan if he wanted to place bets. The boy didn't understand, so he asked again, and Lillian asked what time he thought the princess would arrive. And the young knight noticed that it was already time for the meeting, so he thinks that this is a slight delay due to preparations, so Gloria will come soon. Hearing this, the heroine was a little surprised that Ethan really thought so and realized that, unlike the straightforward Brandon and Olivia, he was still too shy. So Lillian decided to repeat, to clarify, that the boy was betting that the princess would arrive in less than 10 minutes, while the girl herself thought that Gloria would arrive only in an hour. But the main character believed that the bets should be in money, so she suggested betting 1 gold coin or 10. Ethan was a little confused, but said that 10 gold pieces wouldn't hurt him right now and agreed. At that moment, Lillian thought that since she was only 12 years old, she could turn a blind eye to a frivolous bet once, but she had still managed to do a good job, so she couldn't lose her vigilance and only occasionally give herself indulgences. And after thinking it over, the main character accepted Ethan's wish, but suggested that while they wait, it might get really boring. However, the girl decided that it was better to make a promise, and today she will make her first and last bet. Continuing, Lillian said that she had already become addicted to betting, although she did not notice it, but they both still needed to be on their guard. And while Ethan reacted emotionlessly to everything, the main character noticed the hourglass and reached for it. Putting the clock next to her, the girl explained that 1 circle takes about 10 minutes. So if the princess arrives before the sand on top runs out, Ethan wins. To this, the young knight said without further ado that he understood everything, and Lillian, delighted, suggested that they begin. But even after 5 revolutions of the clock, the princess did not appear, and once Gloria came into view, about an hour had passed. The princess, seeing Lillian, pretended to be surprised that she had arrived earlier. Gloria herself was glad that she had made the main character wait for a whole hour, and hoped that she had time to feel insignificant. And coming closer, the princess was waiting for Lillian to raise her face to see her sadness. However, the main character did not live up to Gloria's expectations and looked very happy, which left her very confused. Looking at the girl, the princess did not understand what was wrong and why she was smiling so brightly. After all, Gloria was sure that making Lillian wait for an hour would ruin her mood. At that moment, the heroine saw how the princess's face showed confusion, but the girl herself was simply very pleased to win the bet with Ethan. One of Gloria's friends broke the silence and noted that they still hadn't officially met, so the girl immediately introduced herself, saying that she was Evelyn Mayer. And the second friend didn't keep me waiting long and said that her name was Leah Schmidt. Then the girls both called Lillian by her last name, Lanches, adding that they were pleased to meet her. The heroine didn't like this because she was married to Karen and had to be called by his last name, and from this, Lillian assumed that the invited guests didn't even know the basics of etiquette or had started their own plan. After some time, everyone was actively discussing the main character's marriage, but Leah noticed that there were no guests at the wedding. The girls also noticed that Lillian didn't even have a wedding ring on her finger. And continuing, Leah said that no matter how expensive a dress you put on a low-born woman, you will not become an aristocrat, and Evelyn added that if you pay money to receive a title, it will not reward the deceiver with a historical name. Hearing this, Lillian realized that the guests had just tried to make a sarcastic comment about her title as a duchess. But the heroine still replied that she did not expect to hear such conversations in the imperial palace. Leah was surprised by these words and asked again because she did not think that the place mattered. And Lillian explained that she and Karen had married by official letter from His Majesty the Emperor. However, since the princess is still of immature age, then denying the will of His Majesty should not be a problem. And then Lillian suggested that her marriage to Karen, concluded under the official seal of the Emperor, left some ladies dissatisfied. The main character herself was sure that the princess forced the girls to call her Lanches, but now Gloria is simply calmly observing the situation. However, Lillian decided to ignore this and explained to the guests that she did not have an engagement ring because she was the type of person for whom it was more important to have true love. And the girls immediately and unanimously agreed with the main character, and she was glad and surprised that they corrected themselves so quickly. Although in reality, instead of a ring, there was an object of black magic, so Lillian did not think it was worth talking about. At that moment, Leah justified her words by saying that this marriage was very early, and the ceremony was very inconspicuous, and Evelyn agreed with this, saying that there were rumors around the area that a love potion was used. To this, Lillian immediately made a surprised expression on her face and said that she had never heard of such a thing and didn't even know that it existed. And continuing, the main character explained that her father was favorable to her, and that is why she and Karen got married. So if anyone had any doubts, they could turn to the Duke, but the girls were too shocked that Lillian could communicate with a man in a friendly manner and started asking about it. The heroine said that when she is bored, she always goes to her father's office, and he happily greets her. However, Leah and Evelyn considered the Duke a demon who was famous for his cruelty, so they could not believe what was said. But Lillian decided to change the subject and asked the girls about their usual conversations when they got together like this. And Leah replied that they usually start with a cup of tea and a story about the past day. And continuing, the girl said that the tea ceremony is the basis of etiquette, so tea is always brewed in advance. So the main character, as today's guest, must try the drink. However, Lillian immediately began to analyze everything and understood that since this was the princess's tea party, the tea was not poisoned, and if it was brewed in advance, then she would not dare to use cheap tea leaves. Therefore, the heroine immediately guessed that this was the most obvious trick and began to calmly drink tea. At first glance, there is nothing unusual, but in fact, the tea has a disgustingly bitter taste. And to appreciate the true value of tea, they say that a person must be of age. Taking a sip, Lillian said it was Benemot and guessed it was from the Lane region, as it was much richer and more aromatic than what was available on the market. And while everyone else was in shock, the heroine continued, saying that they had stunned her, because even for a lot of money, buying this tea here takes a lot of effort. Leah thought everything that was happening was strange and assumed that the leaves had been replaced. However, after taking a sip, the girl immediately grimaced from the unpleasant and bitter taste. And Lillian watched this and understood that if she had spat out the tea, they would have ordered her execution. But they chose the wrong person, since the heroine is a big fan of bitter tea. The girl then turned her gaze to Ethan and said that she couldn't come empty-handed, so she had prepared something. And handing Lillian the box, the young knight inquired about the contents, to which she replied that it was her favorite tea. After some time, the heroine made tea, happy that she had not made a mistake and had been able to choose the right gift. Moreover, the girl believed that if someone enjoyed Benemot, then this drink would also be to their taste. And having done the necessary manipulations and waited a little, the main character finished preparing her gift. The ladies who were sitting at the table and watching Lillian's actions were very surprised by what was happening. Seeing this, the heroine immediately asked if she had done something wrong, but the girls, on the contrary, said that everything was amazing. Everyone was also interested in Lillian's knowledge and how she knew about the tea ceremony, but the girl did not want to name names due to lack of knowledge. However, when the main character's stepmother was alive, she often called Lillian to her place. And since there was no reason for torment, since the girl lived quietly and peacefully, the woman herself created a reason. The stepmother hired a teacher who studied with the heroine under the supervision of a woman, but as soon as the teacher left, Lillian received punishment for her mistakes. And because of such terrible torture, in the form of classes that could be called an unhealed callus, the girl does not worry about whether someone will like it or not. Thinking about this, Lillian began to pour tea, and everyone immediately began to admire its color. The heroine agreed that the color of the drink was truly amazing and suggested adding a drop of lemon juice. And as soon as the ladies heard about the lemon, they immediately performed the mysterious action out of curiosity. The color of the tea instantly changed, which was a mystery to Leah and Evelyn, while Lillian laughed at it. However, the princess decided to stop what was happening by asking about the condition of the heroine's legs, since last time she had difficulty walking. And as soon as Gloria started speaking, everyone fell silent, which immediately made one feel the hierarchy in this place. Lillian responded to this by saying that thanks to the princess's sincere concern, she was able to get back on her feet faster. Previously, Gloria sympathized with the main character's parents, which can be considered sweet, but still you shouldn't take the princess's words as the truth. After all, now, having heard about Lillian's condition, Gloria began to smile suspiciously, and the girl immediately noticed this. A few seconds later, expressing some joy, the princess said that since everything was fine with the legs, the heroine would become her personal maid. And while Gloria smiled after what was said and laughed at the situation, Lillian was shocked. Because the main character could not realize and accept the fact that she had to become the princess's personal maid.